Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The Blind Spot. The surveillance camera feed terminated abruptly at 02:17 a.m. All scheduled recordings from the previous day show typical activity, with timestamps consistent and footage uninterrupted. The files were checked for tampering. No anomalies were detected. A detailed review of entry logs indicates no unauthorized access. Procedural checks confirmed operational status of all security systems prior to the incident. Yet the adjacent motion sensors recorded a sequence of activations at 02:19 a.m. despite no visual evidence of movement. I read the report again, my fingers tracing the cold metal edge of the clipboard. The fluorescent light above my desk hums with that persistent frequency that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. The security office smells of burnt coffee and the faint metallic tang of electronic equipment that's been running too hot for too long. 2 minutes, that's the gap that brought me here, staring at screens filled with static where there should be answers. 2 minutes that cost someone their life. The body was discovered in the morning by the cleaning crew. A woman, middle-aged, found in the storage room on the 3rd floor. No signs of forced entry. No weapon recovered. The coroner's preliminary assessment suggested she'd been there since the early morning hours, which aligns perfectly with our mysterious gap in surveillance. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the worn fabric catch against my shirt. The motion sensors don't lie. They recorded movement at 02:19, 2 minutes after the camera went dark, but movement of what or whom? My supervisor had been clear when he assigned me to review the footage. Find the technical malfunction, he'd said, his voice carrying that particular weight of someone who needs a problem to have a simple solution. These systems don't just fail without cause. But as I scroll through frame after frame of ordinary hallway surveillance, I begin to wonder if malfunction is the right word for what happened here. The recordings from the week prior show the same patterns. Employees leaving in the evening, security guards making their rounds, the occasional late-night maintenance worker. The woman appears in several frames, always walking with purpose, always alone. She worked in accounting on the 4th floor, stayed late most evenings according to the logs. I paused the playback on a frame from 3 days before the incident. She's walking toward the elevator, her reflection caught in the polished surface of the directory board near the entrance. But something about the image bothers me. The angle of her shadow doesn't quite match her position relative to the overhead lighting. I rewind and play the sequence again. The shadow shifts in a way that seems almost deliberate, as if she's aware of being watched and adjusting her movements accordingly. Or perhaps that's just my imagination filling in details that aren't really there. The coffee in my cup has gone cold, forming a thin film on the surface that catches the light like oil on water. I take a sip anyway, tasting the bitter residue of grounds that settled at the bottom. Outside the security office, I can hear the building's night sounds, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant ping of elevator arrival bells, the soft squeak of wheels from a cleaning cart somewhere on the upper floors. I switch to the camera feed from the stairwell adjacent to where the body was found. The timestamp shows 02:15, just 2 minutes before our blackout. The frame is empty, showing only the concrete steps and metal handrail disappearing upward into shadows. but there's something else, a quality to the darkness at the top of the visible area that suggests movement just beyond the camera's range. I enhance the image, adjusting brightness and contrast until the shadows reveal their secrets. There, at the very edge of the frame, is what might be the hem of a coat or the bottom edge of a bag. It's barely visible, more suggestion than certainty, but it's there. My hands feel damp against the keyboard as I navigate to the next camera in sequence. This one covers the third-floor hallway where the storage room is located. The timestamp reads 02:16. The hallway appears empty, but the motion sensors for this area show activation at exactly this time. I study every pixel of the image, looking for any sign of the presence the sensors detected. The fluorescent ceiling fixtures cast their usual harsh light across the linoleum floor. The storage room door is closed, its small window reflecting the hallway, lighting back toward the camera like a dark mirror. But wait, in that reflection, there's something that doesn't belong, a shape that doesn't correspond to any of the visible elements in the hallway. I zoom in until the pixels become large enough to count individually, but the anomaly remains. It's as if someone was standing just outside the camera's field of view, their presence captured only in the distorted reflection of the storage room's window. The phone rings, startling me from my analysis. The caller ID shows an internal extension I don't recognize. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice sounding strange in the quiet office. Security. I heard you were reviewing the footage from the incident. The voice is female, older, with a slight rasp that suggests too many cigarettes or not enough sleep. I work in accounting, worked with her. I don't respond immediately, waiting to see what else she might volunteer. The silence stretches between us, filled only by the faint static of the phone line and the distant hum of building systems. She'd been acting strange lately, the voice continues, staying later than usual, taking calls that made her upset. She asked me once if I thought the security cameras could see everything. What did you tell her? That they probably could, that's what they're for, right? There's a pause, and I can hear what sounds like papers rustling in the background. But she said something odd after that. She said sometimes being seen is worse than being hidden. The line goes quiet, and for a moment I think the caller has hung up. Then she speaks again, her voice lower now, more uncertain. I probably shouldn't be calling, but I keep thinking about what she said, about being seen. Can you come down to the security office? I'd like to show you something. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think any of this is a good idea. The line goes dead, leaving me with the dial tone and the growing certainty that the technical malfunction my supervisor wants me to find might be something else entirely. I return to the footage, this time focusing on the timestamps themselves. Each frame is marked with precise digital accuracy, but as I examine them more closely, I notice something peculiar. The sequence from 02:15 to 02:17 plays normally, but there's a subtle inconsistency in the way the numbers change. The transition from 02:16:59 to 02:17:00 seems to take slightly longer than it should, as if the system hesitated for a fraction of a second before advancing. It's a tiny detail, something that would be invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. But it's there, a digital stutter that suggests the recording system experienced some kind of interference or processing delay at the exact moment the camera feed was about to capture something significant. I pull up the technical logs for the recording system, scrolling through lines of automated status reports and error messages. Most of it is routine: disk space warnings, routine maintenance confirmations, network connectivity checks. But buried in the data from that night, I find something interesting. At 02:16:47, the system logged a brief spike in processing demand, as if it was suddenly required to handle a much larger amount of data than usual. The spike lasted exactly 13 seconds, ending at 02:17:00, precisely when the camera feed terminated. I lean back in my chair, trying to piece together what this might mean. Security cameras don't typically generate variable amounts of data unless they're recording something that requires more complex processing. Motion, changes in lighting, or multiple objects moving through the frame can all increase the computational load. But our camera was supposedly recording an empty hallway. What could have caused such a significant spike in processing demand? I decide to examine the audio tracks that accompany the video feeds. Most people don't realize that security cameras record sound as well as images, though the audio quality is usually poor and the range limited. I put on headphones and start playback from 02:15. The sound is mostly what I expected: the ambient noise of a building at rest, punctuated by the occasional creak of settling structure or the distant hum of mechanical systems. But as I approach the 02:16 mark, I begin to hear something else. It starts as a barely perceptible whisper, so quiet I initially mistake it for electrical interference. But as I adjust the volume and apply noise reduction filters, the sound becomes clearer. It's a voice speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I can't make out the words, but the rhythm and cadence are distinctly human. Someone was in that hallway, speaking quietly to someone else. The conversation continues for nearly a minute, growing slightly more animated before cutting off abruptly at 02:17. My hands are shaking slightly as I remove the headphones. The evidence is becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was in that hallway during the time the camera showed it to be empty. Someone who knew how to avoid being seen by the surveillance system while still triggering the motion sensors. But that level of technical knowledge suggests this wasn't a random crime. It was planned, executed by someone who understood our security systems well enough to exploit their limitations. I think about the woman from accounting who called earlier. Her comment about being seen being worse than being hidden takes on new significance now. Had the victim known she was being watched? Had she been trying to avoid the cameras herself? I pull up the employee database and search for anyone with access to the security system technical specifications. The list is shorter than I expected: myself, my supervisor, 2 maintenance technicians, and the building manager. But there's also a notation about a recent security audit that would have given temporary access to an outside consulting firm. The audit was completed just 2 weeks before the incident. I make a note to request the full report and contact information for the consultants involved. As I'm writing, I become aware of a sound that doesn't belong to the usual building ambience. It's rhythmic, like footsteps, but with an odd quality that makes it difficult to locate. The sound seems to be coming from somewhere above my office, but the building directory shows that area as unoccupied storage space. I save my work and lock the computer terminal before stepping into the hallway. The sound is clearer out here, definitely footsteps, but with an irregular pattern that suggests someone moving carefully, deliberately trying to minimize noise. The elevator is too slow and too loud for what I have in mind. I take the stairs, climbing as quietly as possible toward the source of the sound. The stairwell is dimly lit, with emergency lighting that casts long shadows between the floors. As I reach the landing for the storage level, the footsteps stop. I wait, controlling my breathing, listening for any indication of where the person might have gone. The silence is complete, almost oppressive in its totality. I push through the fire door into the storage area. The space is filled with filing cabinets, old furniture, and boxes of archived documents. The air smells of dust and aging paper, with an underlying chemical odor that might be from old cleaning supplies or deteriorating adhesives. The overhead lighting is controlled by motion sensors, and they activate as I enter, flooding the area with harsh fluorescent illumination. But the sudden brightness reveals nothing more threatening than rows of metal shelving and cardboard storage containers. I walk slowly through the aisles, checking behind larger items and looking for any sign that someone else has been here recently. Most surfaces are covered with a fine layer of dust that would show footprints or disturbances, but everything appears undisturbed. It's only as I'm preparing to leave that I notice the smell. It's faint, almost masked by the other odors in the space, but distinctly out of place. It's the scent of coffee, fresh coffee, still warm enough to release its aroma into the stale air of the storage room. I follow the smell toward the back corner of the space, where a small office area has been set up among the archived files. There's a desk, a chair, and a small table with a coffee maker. The machine is still warm, its indicator light glowing red to show the heating element is active. Next to the coffee maker is a cup, still steaming, and a manila folder containing what appears to be security system documentation. The papers are covered with handwritten notes in a script I don't recognize, but the technical diagrams and camera placement maps are definitely from our building. I'm reaching for the folder when I hear the fire door close with a soft pneumatic hiss. The footsteps resume, but now they're moving away from the storage area, back toward the stairwell. I abandon the folder and move quickly toward the door, but by the time I reach the landing, the stairwell is empty. The sound of footsteps echoes from somewhere below, but the acoustic properties of the concrete enclosure make it impossible to determine exactly where. I descend as quickly as I dare, but when I reach the ground floor, I find only the usual night security guard making his rounds. He looks surprised to see me. Working late tonight. Following up on some footage irregularities, did you see anyone else in the building just now? He checks his log sheet, running his finger down a column of timestamps and locations. Just the cleaning crew on floors 2 and 4, and the maintenance guy was here earlier, but he signed out around midnight. What about the storage level? Anyone have access to that area? Not supposed to, that's restricted access only. Why? I don't answer directly, instead asking him to accompany me back to the storage area. But when we return, the improvised office space is gone. The desk and chair are still there, but the coffee maker has been unplugged and moved to a different table. The folder with the security documentation has vanished entirely. The security guard examines the area with professional skepticism. Looks like it's been set up this way for a while. See how the dust patterns have settled around the furniture. This stuff hasn't been moved recently. But I can still smell the coffee, faint but unmistakable. And when I check the coffee maker, the heating element is still slightly warm to the touch. We return to the security office, where I show the guard the footage from the night of the incident. He watches with the practiced eye of someone who spent years looking at surveillance monitors, but his expression remains neutral until we reach the gap at 02:17. Technical glitch, he says without hesitation. Happens sometimes with the older cameras. Usually it's a power fluctuation or a problem with the network connection. What about the motion sensor activations after the camera went dark? He shrugs. Could be anything. Temperature changes, vibrations from the building systems, even small animals sometimes. Motion sensors aren't perfect. His explanations are reasonable, logical, the kind of practical assessment that comes from experience with security systems. But they don't account for the voice I heard in the audio track or the evidence of someone working in the storage area with detailed knowledge of our surveillance network. After he leaves to continue his rounds, I return to the computer terminal and load the audio file from the incident night. I play the section with the whispered conversation, adjusting the filters and enhancement settings to try to extract more clarity from the recording. With careful manipulation, I'm able to isolate what sounds like two distinct voices. One is higher, more agitated, speaking in short, urgent phrases. The other is deeper, calmer, responding with longer statements that have the cadence of explanations or instructions. I can't make out specific words, but the emotional content is clear. This was an argument, or at least a tense discussion between two people who disagreed about something important. The conversation ends abruptly, followed by what sounds like a door closing and then silence until the camera feed terminates. In that final moment before the recording ends, I hear something else, a sound that might be a key turning in a lock or possibly the click of electronic equipment being activated. I save the enhanced audio file and begin transcribing what few words I can decipher. Most of it is fragmentary, but a few phrases emerge with enough clarity to be significant. I told you this was dangerous. No other choice now. And they'll figure it out eventually. The pronouns are ambiguous, offering no clear indication of who was speaking or who they were discussing. But the content suggests knowledge of the crime before it occurred and awareness that the security system posed a threat to their plans. I'm studying the transcript when the phone rings again. This time the caller ID shows my supervisor's extension, which is unusual given the late hour. Still in the office. Working on the surveillance analysis, I found some interesting anomalies. I described the audio evidence and the processing spike that preceded the camera failure. There's a long pause before he responds. I need you to focus on the technical aspects. The investigation team will handle the other elements. But the evidence suggests a system malfunction that coincided with a criminal act. That's not unusual. What I need from you is a technical report that explains how the camera failed and what we can do to prevent similar failures in the future. His tone carries a finality that discourages further discussion, but I press on anyway. Someone was using the storage area as a base of operations. They had detailed knowledge of our security systems, including camera positions and sensor coverage patterns. The storage area is used by maintenance personnel. Any documentation found there would be part of routine building operations. The coffee was still warm. Another pause, longer this time. When he speaks again, his voice has taken on a different quality, more careful and deliberate. I think you've been working too hard on this. Why don't you finish up your technical analysis and take tomorrow off? Fresh perspective might help. The conversation ends, but I remain at my desk, staring at the screens full of evidence that seems to matter less and less to the people who should be most interested in it. The investigation is being steered away from the surveillance anomalies, channeled toward a simpler narrative that doesn't require uncomfortable questions about how someone could manipulate our security systems so effectively. I copy the enhanced audio files and my analysis notes to a portable drive, then clear the computer's temporary files and browser history. If this evidence is going to be buried, I want to make sure a copy survives somewhere outside the official investigation. The building is quieter now, deep into the hours when even the most dedicated workers have gone home. But as I prepare to leave, I notice something on one of the monitor screens that stops me cold. Camera 12, which covers the main entrance, shows a figure standing just outside the building's front doors. The person is facing the camera directly, but their features are obscured by shadows and the angle of the overhead lighting. They're not moving, just standing there as if waiting for something. I check the timestamp 03:47 a.m. They've been there for several minutes, long enough for the motion sensors to have detected them, but the building's automated systems show no alerts or notifications. I switch to the exterior cameras to get a better view, but the figure has vanished. The entrance area is empty, showing only the usual nighttime scene of empty sidewalks and parked cars under the streetlights. But as I scroll back through the footage, I realize the person was never actually there. The timestamp shows continuous recording, but there's no moment when the figure arrives or departs. They simply appear in one frame and are gone in the next, as if they existed only in that single moment of digital capture. I check the camera's technical status, looking for signs of malfunction or interference, but everything appears normal. The system is operating within standard parameters, recording and storing data exactly as it should. Yet someone was there, standing in full view of our surveillance network, somehow present and absent simultaneously. I think about the woman who died and her comment about being seen being worse than being hidden. I think about the voices in the hallway discussing danger and inevitability. I think about my supervisor's eagerness to limit the investigation to technical malfunctions. And I begin to understand that the real crime here might not be what happened in that storage room, but what's happening now, in the careful management of evidence and the systematic discouragement of inconvenient questions. The surveillance system didn't fail. It was made to fail by someone who understood exactly how to create a gap in our digital memory without leaving traces of tampering. Someone who could move through our building's security network like a ghost, triggering sensors while avoiding cameras, present in reflections but absent from direct observation. The woman from accounting was right to be afraid. Being seen was worse than being hidden, because being seen meant becoming a threat to someone who had learned to exist in the spaces between our electronic eyes. I gather my notes in the portable drive, knowing that my official report will describe technical malfunctions and system limitations. But somewhere in the building's digital memory, in the spaces between frames and the silence between words, the truth waits for someone willing to look beyond what the cameras show to see what they were meant to hide. The motion sensors will continue to record activations with no corresponding visual evidence. the shadows will shift in ways that don't match the lighting. And in the storage areas and forgotten corners of the building, someone will continue to move unseen, leaving only the faint scent of coffee and the whisper of voices discussing things that were never meant to be recorded. I turn off the monitors and lock the security office, but I know I'll be back. Because somewhere in those 2 minutes of darkness, in that gap between what was recorded and what was hidden, lies a truth that refuses to stay buried. The building settles around me as I walk toward the exit, its familiar sounds taking on new significance. Every footstep, every mechanical noise, every shadow could be evidence or coincidence, truth or imagination. And in that uncertainty, in the space between seeing and knowing, the real mystery continues to unfold. Story 2. The picture seemed to hang too deliberately, its edges slightly tilted, capturing an unease I couldn't shake. The room was quiet, yet the walls felt alive with whispers I couldn't quite hear. My eyes drifted to the shadows stretching, almost touching but stopping short of union. A draft brushed past, nudging the curtains that swayed imperceptibly, suggesting a presence unseen. I waited, caught between the decision to stay or turn away, each second stretching thin. Then I noticed a speck of light refracting off the glass surface, a glint that hadn't been there before. That glint, I keep coming back to it, like picking at a scab that won't heal. Sometimes I think it was just dust catching the afternoon sun, but other times I remember the way it seemed to pulse, almost alive. The carpet was brown, no burgundy, the kind that shows every footprint, every disturbance. I remember staring at it, tracing patterns that weren't really there while someone spoke behind me. The voice was familiar, but I can't place it now. Can't even remember if it was male or female. "You should sit down," they said, or maybe it was, "You should leave now." The words blur together like watercolors in rain. I was holding something. My hands remember the weight of it, the smooth surface, the way my fingers found grooves worn by countless other touches. A book, no, too thin, too cold, metal maybe. But when I try to see it clearly, the memory fractures. The house smelled like vanilla and something underneath, something sour that the vanilla couldn't quite mask. I breathed through my mouth after a while, but the taste lingered anyway. Sweet rot, that's what it was, sweet rot hiding in the walls. There was a conversation I should remember, someone explaining something important, their hands moving as they talked. I watched their mouth form words that seemed to echo before they spoke them. But I was distracted by that glint, by the way the light kept catching in the picture frame, drawing my attention like a lighthouse beacon. "Are you listening?" the voice again, sharper now, impatient. I nodded, but I wasn't. I was thinking about the curtains, how they moved without any wind I could feel. How the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. How the picture, what was in that picture anyway, seemed to watch me watching it. The frame was old, tarnished silver, maybe pewter, the kind you inherit rather than buy. Inside was a photograph, but the details swim away whenever I try to focus. Faces that might have been smiling or screaming, light and dark in all the wrong places. I left that house. I remember walking to my car, feeling eyes on my back from windows I didn't dare turn to check. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine turned over on the third try, and I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. But that was wrong. I didn't drive away. I stayed. I stayed and watched the sun move across the floor, watched the shadows grow longer, watched that glint of light travel across the glass like a searchlight sweeping for something lost. Someone made tea. The cups were delicate floral patterns that reminded me of my grandmother's china. But my grandmother never owned china, never owned anything delicate. So whose memory was that? Whose hands poured the steaming water? Whose voice asked if I wanted sugar? 1 lump or 2? I said 2, but I don't take sugar. Never have. But in that moment, in that room with its watching walls and breathing shadows, I said 2 because it seemed important to give the right answer. The tea tasted like dust, like old flowers pressed between book pages. I drank it anyway, watching steam rise from the cup and dissipate somewhere near the ceiling. The ceiling was white, perfectly, impossibly white, like fresh snow or clean bones. That's when I noticed the other pictures, not just the one that had caught my attention, but others scattered around the room like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. All in similar frames, all with that same quality of being too deliberately placed, too carefully arranged. But I can't remember what they showed. Every time I try to focus on their contents, my mind slides away like water on glass. There's a wall there, a barrier my consciousness built to protect itself from something it decided I shouldn't see. The person in the room with me, I should know who they were. They knew me well enough to anticipate how I took my tea, even when I didn't. They spoke to me like we'd had this conversation before, like we were picking up threads of something started long ago. You don't remember, do you? That question hangs in my mind like smoke. Remember what? The day itself feels stolen, patched together from fragments that don't quite fit, like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces from different boxes. I remember leaving, again, this time I'm certain. The door handle was brass, worn smooth by countless hands. It turned easily, too easily, as if the house wanted me gone. The afternoon air hit my face like a slap, clean and cold after the vanilla-sweet atmosphere inside. But as I walked away, I heard something, a sound that followed me down the path across the street into my car, a sound like glass breaking but distant, muffled, like it was happening in another room or another time. The drive home is a blank. I remember being in that house, and then I remember being in my own kitchen, staring at my hands wrapped around a coffee mug. The transition between those two moments is gone, edited out by whatever mechanism in my brain decides what's safe to remember. My coffee was cold, had been cold for a while, judging by the skin that had formed on top, but I couldn't remember making it. Couldn't remember coming home, parking the car, walking through my own front door. The lost time sat in my stomach like a stone. That night I dreamed of the glint in the picture frame. In the dream, it wasn't light reflecting off glass. It was an eye, watching, waiting, following my movements around the room like a security camera with malevolent intent. I woke with the taste of vanilla in my mouth and the smell of sweet rot in my nostrils. Both faded as consciousness took hold, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they didn't want to let go. The next morning I called someone. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. I'm not even sure whose number I dialed. My fingers seemed to know the sequence, but my mind couldn't connect it to a name or face. Later, I found a business card in my pocket, plain white with a phone number printed in simple black type. No name, no address, just those 10 digits that looked familiar but meaningless. I threw it away, then retrieved it from the trash, threw it away again, retrieved it again. Finally, I tucked it into a book where I wouldn't have to look at it but would know where to find it. The book was about memory, how it works, how it fails, how it protects us from things we're not ready to face. I don't remember buying it, but there it was on my shelf, spine cracked from frequent reading. One passage was highlighted in yellow. The mind will sacrifice accuracy for survival, rewriting history to preserve sanity. The highlighting looked like my handwriting. but I couldn't remember making those marks. Weeks passed, or maybe months. Time became fluid, unreliable. I'd find myself in places with no memory of the journey, standing in grocery store aisles, staring at shelves without knowing what I'd come to buy, sitting in my car in parking lots, engine running, with no destination in mind. But always that glint of light haunted the edges of my vision. Not literally, I wasn't hallucinating, but metaphorically, symbolically, it lived in the corner of my consciousness like a splinter I couldn't extract. I started seeing similar glints everywhere, in windows, in mirrors, in puddles on the street. Each one made my heart race for reasons I couldn't explain. Each one whispered of that room, that picture, that conversation I couldn't quite remember. The vanilla smell came back sometimes, usually when I was tired, when my defenses were down. I'd catch a whiff of it in crowded places, on buses, in elevators, but when I'd turn to find the source, there would be nothing, just strangers with their own secrets, their own forgotten rooms. I went back once, or tried to. I drove through streets that should have been familiar, looking for a house that should have been easy to find. But the neighborhood had changed, or my memory had. Streets that should have led somewhere led nowhere. Houses that should have been there weren't. I parked and walked, hoping muscle memory would guide me where conscious thought couldn't. But every door looked wrong. Every window reflected back only my own confused face. Had I imagined it all, the room, the picture, the glint of light that still haunted my peripheral vision, but the taste of that dusty tea was too real, too specific to be fabrication. The feel of that object in my hands, whatever it was, too tactile to be fantasy. That night I called the number on the business card. It rang once, twice, then connected to a recording. A voice I almost recognized spoke a single word: remember. Then the line went dead. The word echoed in my mind like a stone dropped in still water. Remember what? Remember when? Remember who? The command was both urgent and useless, like being told to breathe while drowning. I tried hypnosis, self-hypnosis, guided meditation, anything that promised to unlock the doors my mind had sealed. But each attempt led to the same place, that room, that picture, that glint of light, and then a wall, solid and impenetrable, protecting me from whatever lay beyond. The therapist I consulted, a woman with kind eyes and patient hands, suggested that some memories weren't meant to be recovered, that the mind's protective mechanisms existed for good reason. Sometimes, she said, forgetting is the only way to survive. But survival felt hollow when it came at the cost of truth. I was living in a story with missing pages, trying to understand a plot with crucial scenes edited out. The dreams became more frequent. Always the same room, always the same tilted picture, always that glint of light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But now there were voices in the dreams, conversations just below the threshold of understanding. You have to know, one voice insisted. You have to remember. Some things are better left buried, another replied. I'd wake from these dreams with tears on my face and words on my lips that dissolved before I could capture them. The business card disappeared from the book where I'd hidden it. I searched everywhere, tearing apart drawers and closets, but it was gone, as if it had never existed, as if I'd imagined that too. But the number remained burned in my memory. Those 10 digits that connected to nothing but a recording, a single word, a dead line. I began to notice patterns in my daily life. Certain routes I avoided without conscious decision. Certain streets that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. certain neighborhoods that triggered a flight response I couldn't explain. My body remembered what my mind refused to acknowledge. The glint appeared again, not in a dream but in waking life. I was walking past a shop window when I saw it, that same quality of light refracting off glass, that same sense of being watched. I stopped, heart pounding, and stared at my own reflection staring back. But behind my reflected face I glimpsed something else. A room, a picture, a tilt that suggested deliberate arrangement. I turned to look through the window properly, but saw only the shop's interior. Mundane objects arranged on mundane shelves, nothing that should have triggered such a visceral response. The shopkeeper, a woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, came to the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I shook my head and walked away, but felt her watching until I turned the corner. That night the phone rang, no caller ID, just the insistent electronic chirping that pulled me from uneasy sleep. I answered on the fourth ring. "You're running out of time," a voice said, the same voice from the recording, but lived now, present. "Time for what?" I asked, but the line was already dead. The next morning I found a photograph slipped under my door, black and white, slightly out of focus, showing a room I almost recognized. A picture hanging on a wall, its frame catching light from an unseen window. My hands shook as I held it. This was evidence, proof that my fragmented memories had some basis in reality. But it was also a message, a reminder of something I'd tried so hard to forget. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were two words: "Come back." The invitation terrified me, but so did the alternative. Living forever in this liminal space between memory and forgetting, between truth and protective fiction. I got in my car and drove, not to any specific destination, but following instincts I didn't understand. Left here, right there, straight through an intersection that looked familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. And there it was, the house, unchanged, waiting as if no time had passed since my last visit. The same windows, the same door, the same sense of watchful patience. I sat in the car for a long time, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel like an anchor. The house stared back at me through glass eyes, daring me to remember, daring me to forget. The front door opened, though I hadn't seen anyone approach it. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the interior light, familiar but unplaceable, like a word on the tip of my tongue. They raised one hand in greeting or invitation. I couldn't tell which. My hand moved to the car door handle. The metal was cold, real, substantial. The choice was mine to make: drive away and live with the questions, or walk forward and face whatever answers waited inside. The glint of light appeared again, refracting off my car window, off the house's windows, off surfaces I couldn't identify. Multiplying, spreading, until the whole world seemed to sparkle with that same watchful intensity. I opened the car door and stepped out. The air smelled of vanilla and sweet rot, just as I remembered, just as I'd tried to forget. The figure in the doorway waited patiently as I walked up the path. Each step felt like a choice, like a small surrender to whatever truth lay ahead. "You came back," they said as I approached. Their voice was the one from my dreams, from the phone calls, from the recording. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why I'd come or what I hoped to find. "The picture is still hanging," they said, stepping aside to let me enter. still catching the light just the same way. Inside, the room was exactly as I'd left it, or as I'd tried to remember leaving it. The same shadows, the same vanilla-scented air, the same sense of suspended time. And there on the wall, the picture hung at its deliberate angle. The glint of light danced across its surface, alive and waiting and somehow aware. I walked toward it slowly, feeling the weight of forgotten knowledge pressing against the barriers in my mind. With each step, the protective walls grew thinner, more permeable. "What am I supposed to remember?" I asked. The figure behind me was quiet for a long moment, then looked closer at the picture, really look. I stepped forward until I was close enough to see my own reflection in the glass. But behind my reflected face, the image in the frame began to resolve into clarity. It wasn't what I'd expected, wasn't what I'd feared. It was simply a photograph of this very room, taken from where I now stood. A picture of a picture, creating an infinite regression that made my eyes water to follow. But in that photograph within the photograph, I could see a figure standing exactly where I stood now. And in their hands, they held something that caught the light. Something metallic, something familiar. Something I was holding right now. I looked down at my hands and saw the object I'd carried into this room without realizing it. The business card somehow returned to my possession, but now I could see it clearly, read the words that had been invisible before. Not a business card at all, but something else. Something that explained everything and nothing. Something that made the glint of light pulse with recognition and the vanilla-scented air taste like truth. The picture seemed to hang too deliberately, its edges slightly tilted, capturing an unease I couldn't shake. But now I understood why it hung that way, why the tilt was necessary, why the glint of light had called me back. Some stories don't have endings, only pauses between tellings. Some truths can only be approached sideways, glimpsed in peripheral vision, caught in the refraction of light off glass. I stood in that room holding my small piece of the puzzle, watching the shadows stretch and almost touch. Outside, the curtains swayed with their invisible presence, and somewhere in the walls, whispers continued conversations that had never really ended. The glint of light pulsed once more, acknowledging what I'd found and what I'd lost and what I'd chosen to remember. Then it settled into stillness, waiting for the next seeker to notice its deliberate gleam. Story 3. Latch clicked but didn't catch. My fingers traced the wood grain on the door, searching for a snag to justify its smooth, silent refusal. Light from the street spilled in, distorting the familiar contours of the hallway into something foreign. The walls seemed to pulse, an imperceptible current whispering along their surface, daring me to reach out and feel what wasn't there. I navigated through the dimness, each footfall swallowed by the space. The air hung heavily, unmoving, as if it too waited for a cue. Yet the absence lingered like a touch I couldn't return, leaving only a fading mark on my awareness. I knew what had happened that night. The sequence played out in my mind with crystalline clarity, each moment connected to the next like dominoes falling in perfect order. I had returned home late from work, the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into my shoulders as I climbed the stairs. The apartment had been exactly as I left it, keys on the small table by the entrance, mail stacked neatly beside them, the faint scent of morning coffee still clinging to the kitchen air. My roommate had been in the living room, sitting in that oversized chair by the window, reading. We'd exchanged our usual pleasantries. How was your day? Anything interesting happened? Did you remember to pay the electric bill? Normal conversation between two people who had shared space for months, comfortable in our routine of polite coexistence. I remembered the book in those hands, something thick with a dark cover, the kind of mystery novel that cluttered the shelves throughout our shared space. After perhaps 20 minutes of idle chat, I had retreated to my room to change clothes and prepare for bed. The sounds from the living room continued, pages turning, the occasional shift in the chair, the soft thud of the book being set down on the side table. These were the ambient noises of home, the reassuring evidence that life was proceeding as expected within our walls. When I emerged from my room an hour later, seeking a glass of water from the kitchen, the apartment had fallen silent. The living room sat empty, the chair vacant, the book closed and resting where I had last seen it placed. I assumed my roommate had gone to bed, perhaps while I was in the shower and couldn't hear footsteps in the hallway. This seemed perfectly reasonable. People retire at different hours, follow their own rhythms of sleep and waking. But something felt wrong with the chair. Not visibly wrong, it looked exactly as it always did, positioned at the same angle to catch the best light from the window, the same worn patches on the armrests where countless hours of reading had left their mark. Yet when I looked at it, my chest tightened with an inexplicable unease. The fabric seemed too smooth, as if no one had sat there recently. The cushion showed no impression, no evidence of a body having occupied that space. I touched the seat, cool to the touch, not warm as it should have been if someone had just risen from it. The book, when I picked it up, felt wrong in my hands. The pages fell open to a section that had clearly been read many times. The spine was creased, the paper soft with handling, but the words swam before my eyes like they were written in a language I didn't recognize. That first night, I convinced myself that memory plays tricks. Perhaps more time had passed than I realized. Perhaps the conversation in the living room had happened earlier, and my roommate had been gone for hours before I noticed. Time has a way of compressing and expanding when you're tired, when your mind is occupied with the mundane concerns of daily life. I placed the book back on the table and went to bed, pushing away the nagging sense that something fundamental had shifted in the apartment's atmosphere. The next morning brought no clarity. I woke to find the kitchen exactly as I had left it, no evidence that anyone else had prepared breakfast or coffee. The bathroom showed similar signs of solitary use, only my toothbrush was damp, only my towel showed signs of recent use. When I called out a greeting to the apartment at large, my voice echoed back from empty rooms. This pattern continued for days. I would return from work expecting to find signs of another person's presence, dishes in the sink, clothes in the hamper, the lingering warmth of recent occupation. Instead, I found only the careful arrangement of objects that suggested a space maintained by a single inhabitant. The mail that accumulated by the door bore only my name. The refrigerator contained only items I remembered purchasing. Yet the sensation of another presence persisted. Not a ghostly presence, nothing supernatural or otherworldly, but the feeling that someone had recently been in these rooms, had touched these objects, had breathed this air. Sometimes I would enter a room and catch the faintest trace of an unfamiliar scent, not perfume or cologne, but something more subtle, the particular odor that clings to different people's clothing, their hair, their skin. The logical explanation seemed obvious. My roommate had moved out. Perhaps there had been a conversation about it that I had forgotten, plans made and executed while my attention was focused elsewhere. People leave without fanfare all the time, especially in arrangements that were always intended to be temporary. The lease was in my name alone. There would be no legal complications, no forwarding address required. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this explanation, however reasonable, didn't account for the strangeness of that final evening. The conversation we had shared felt too vivid, too recent to have been a memory from weeks or months ago. I could still recall specific words, the inflection of voice, the way the light from the window had fallen across the pages of that book. When I tried to remember earlier conversations, earlier shared moments in the apartment, my memory became unreliable. Had we ever eaten meals together? Had we ever watched television in the same room, or discussed our respective work days, or complained about the neighbors? These scenes felt hazy, like memories of dreams rather than actual experiences. I began to search the apartment more systematically, looking for evidence of another person's residence. The closets contained only my clothes. The medicine cabinet held only my prescriptions and toiletries. Every drawer, every shelf, every storage space showed signs of organization that reflected my habits alone. Yet in quiet moments, when I sat very still and listened carefully, I could swear I heard the sound of breathing that wasn't my own. Not loud enough to locate, not consistent enough to investigate, but present enough to make me question whether I was truly alone in the space. The book remained on the side table by the chair. When I tried to read it, the words seemed to rearrange themselves on the page. The story, as far as I could follow it, concerned a person who gradually realized that their perception of reality didn't match the evidence around them. The protagonists struggled to reconcile what they remembered with what they could prove, finding that memory and truth existed in separate, incompatible realms. I began to wonder if I had been living alone all along. Perhaps the roommate had never existed outside my imagination, a psychological construct created to make the solitude of the apartment more bearable. People invent companions when isolation becomes too overwhelming. They create elaborate fantasies of shared domestic life, complete with conversations and routines and the comfortable friction of cohabitation. This possibility terrified me more than any external explanation. If I could invent an entire person, complete with habits and preferences and a physical presence substantial enough to leave impressions in furniture, then my grip on reality was far more tenuous than I had ever suspected. The line between what I experienced and what actually happened had become impossibly blurred. But then I would find things, small things, easily overlooked but impossible to explain away. A coffee mug in the dishwasher that I didn't recognize, clean but showing signs of recent use. A book moved from one shelf to another, its position changed in a way that suggested someone had been browsing and replaced it imperfectly. The thermostat adjusted to a temperature I never would have chosen. These discoveries sent waves of relief through me, proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that another person had indeed shared this space. But they also raised more disturbing questions. If my roommate had existed, where had they gone, and why had they left behind so little evidence of their presence? I started keeping a journal, documenting every anomaly, every moment when the apartment felt occupied by more than just myself. The entries began rationally enough factual observations about objects out of place or sounds that couldn't be easily explained. But as days passed, my writing became more frantic, more desperate to establish some kind of truth that would make sense of my experience. The entries revealed patterns I hadn't consciously noticed. The sense of another presence was strongest in the evening, around the time when I remembered having that final conversation. It was during these hours that I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, hear the soft sounds of someone settling into the chair by the window, smell that elusive scent of another person's proximity. I began to suspect that my roommate hadn't left at all. Perhaps they were still in the apartment, existing in some parallel version of our shared space that occasionally overlapped with my own perception. This wasn't a supernatural theory exactly, but something more like a glitch in the way I processed sensory information. Maybe trauma or stress had fractured my awareness, creating gaps in my perception that allowed another person to exist undetected. The chair became the focal point of my investigation. I would position myself where I could observe it directly, waiting for signs of occupation. Hours would pass with no visible change, but I remained convinced that someone was sitting there, just beyond the threshold of my ability to perceive them clearly. One evening, as I watched the chair with particular intensity, I saw the cushion depress slightly, as if under the weight of a body. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. I held my breath, waiting for further evidence, but the chair remained still. When I approached to examine it more closely, the cushion showed no sign of recent pressure. These moments of near contact became more frequent. I would enter a room and sense that someone had just left it, the air still stirring with their passage. I would reach for an object and feel warmth that suggested another person's touch. I would lie in bed at night and hear the soft sounds of someone moving through the apartment, preparing for sleep in a room I couldn't locate. The boundary between what I remembered and what I was experiencing in the present began to dissolve. The conversation from that final evening started to feel like something that was happening continuously, replaying itself in an endless loop that I could almost but never quite hear clearly. The words changed each time I tried to recall them, but the emotional tone remained constant, friendly, routine, unremarkable in every way except for its persistence. I realized that I had been asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering where my roommate had gone, I should have been wondering whether they had ever been there at all. And instead of trying to prove their existence through physical evidence, I should have been examining why I needed so desperately to believe in their presence. The apartment felt too large for one person, too carefully arranged, too full of spaces that seemed designed for shared occupation. Perhaps I had moved in expecting to live with someone else, had furnished and organized the rooms with that assumption, and had then created an imaginary companion to fill the role that no real person had ever occupied. But this explanation, like all the others, felt incomplete. It accounted for some aspects of my experience while leaving others mysterious. The physical evidence, the moved objects, the warm surfaces, the depression in the chair suggested something more complex than simple loneliness or wishful thinking. As I write this, sitting in the chair by the window with that mysterious book open in my lap, I can feel another presence in the room. Not threatening, not malevolent, but undeniably there. The sensation is strongest when I'm not trying to detect it, when my attention is focused elsewhere and my conscious mind isn't actively searching for proof. I no longer know what happened that night when I came home to find the apartment seemingly empty. I don't know if my roommate ever existed, or if they're still here in some form I can't directly perceive, or if they left in a way that somehow erased most traces of their presence while leaving behind just enough evidence to drive me toward madness. What I do know is that the truth feels like something I'm always on the verge of grasping, but never quite able to hold. It exists in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the moments when perception shifts just enough to reveal possibilities that vanish as soon as I try to examine them directly. The latch on the door still doesn't catch properly. Every night I trace the wood grain with my fingers, searching for an explanation that continues to elude me. And every night, as I move through the apartment's dim hallways, I feel that lingering absence like a touch I can't return, leaving only a fading mark on my awareness that might be memory, might be imagination, or might be something else entirely. Story 4. The key slid in without a sound. I turned it, anticipating the slight resistance of the lock, but it remained unfazed, unmoving. As I stepped inside, the air felt thick, as if each particle was holding its breath. My shoes made no sound on the carpet, a glaring absence of the familiar soft crunch. The light switch failed to click, leaving the room wrapped in a soft, deceptive gloom. My hand brushed against the table, yet no texture registered. It was as if the surfaces conspired in silence. A draft touched my cheek, or perhaps it was only the memory of one. I hesitated, sensing the walls themselves were watching, aware of a truth just out of reach. I had come here to check on my brother. It was that simple, really. He hadn't answered his phone for 3 days, which wasn't entirely unusual, but something in my gut told me to drive over. The spare key was exactly where he always kept it, under the ceramic frog by the front steps. I remember thinking how predictable he was, how he never learned to vary his routines despite my constant warnings about security. The apartment looked normal enough. His coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, half filled with what appeared to be cold coffee. The newspaper was folded to the crossword puzzle, only partially completed. His reading glasses lay beside it, one arm slightly bent. Everything suggested he had simply stepped out for a moment, perhaps to grab groceries or take a walk around the neighborhood. But there was something about the stillness that bothered me. Not just quiet, but a kind of suspended animation, as if time had stopped mid-breath. The refrigerator hummed its usual tune, yet the sound seemed to come from somewhere far away. I walked through the living room, noting how the couch cushions held no impression, how the remote control sat perfectly aligned with the coffee table's edge. His bedroom door stood ajar. I pushed it open gently, half expecting to find him napping, but the bed was made with military precision. The corners tucked so tightly they could bounce a quarter. This struck me as odd because my brother was many things, but meticulous was not one of them. His usual style leaned more toward organized chaos. I called his name anyway, my voice echoing strangely in the small space. No response. I checked the bathroom, the closet, even looked out onto the fire escape. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place, yet everything felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The logical explanation was simple. He had gone away for a few days without mentioning it. Maybe a last-minute work trip or a spontaneous weekend with friends. He was impulsive like that, always had been since we were kids. I could picture him throwing some clothes in a bag, forgetting to charge his phone, heading off on some adventure without a second thought about worried family members. I decided to wait a while, settling into his armchair with a book from his shelf. The leather felt cool against my back, and I remember thinking how comfortable the chair was, how it seemed to mold itself to my body as if it had been waiting for me specifically. But as I sat there, small details began to nag at me. The coffee in the mug had no film on top, no ring around the edges that would suggest it had been sitting for hours. The newspaper was dated from the current day, yet it was already afternoon, and my brother never woke up early enough to read the paper before noon. The bent arm on his glasses caught my eye again. He was obsessive about his eyewear, always cleaning the lenses, always handling them carefully. A scent drifted through the air, something metallic and sharp that made my nose wrinkle. I got up to investigate, following the smell toward the kitchen. It seemed to be coming from the sink, but when I looked down the drain, I saw nothing unusual. The garbage disposal was clean, the dishes were washed and put away. That's when I noticed the kitchen window was open just a crack. The building was on a busy street, yet I heard no traffic noise, no urban symphony of horns and engines. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton, muffled and unnatural. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, though I don't remember walking there. My reflection looked back at me, but something was off about the angle, as if the mirror was tilted slightly, showing me from a perspective that didn't quite match where I was standing. I reached up to touch the glass, and for a moment I could swear my reflection hesitated before following the movement. The apartment began to feel smaller, the walls closing in with each breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. But the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I called my brother's phone again, and this time I heard something that made my blood run cold. The faint sound of ringing was coming from inside the apartment. I followed the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs until I traced it to the hall closet. The phone was there, sitting on the top shelf, fully charged and displaying my missed calls from the past 3 days. This changed everything. My brother never went anywhere without his phone. He was practically attached to the device, constantly checking messages, scrolling through social media, taking photos of his meals. The idea that he would leave it behind was almost impossible to believe. I sat down heavily on the couch, trying to process this new information. The cushions gave way beneath me, and I realized they weren't as pristine as I had initially thought. There was a slight depression where someone had been sitting recently, and when I pressed my hand into the fabric, it was still warm. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. I was standing in the same living room, but it was different somehow, darker. The furniture was arranged differently, or maybe it was the same but viewed from another angle. Someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. The voice was urgent, pleading, but it seemed to come from underwater, distorted and strange. I blinked and the memory dissolved like smoke. I was back in the present, sitting on the couch, staring at the coffee table. But now I noticed something I had missed before. There was a faint outline in the dust, a rectangle where something had been moved recently. Something about the size of a laptop computer. My brother's laptop was nowhere to be found. I searched every room again, more thoroughly this time, checking under beds and cabinets behind curtains. The computer was gone, along with his wallet and keys, but if he had taken these things with him, why leave his phone behind? The metallic smell returned, stronger now, accompanied by something else, something organic and unsettling that made my stomach turn. I found myself drawn back to the kitchen, though every instinct told me to leave the apartment immediately. The sink looked different now. The chrome faucet, which had been spotless before, now showed water spots and fingerprints. The dish towel hanging from the oven handle was damp, though I was certain it had been dry when I first arrived. I ran my fingers along the edge of the counter, feeling for something I couldn't name. The surface was smooth and cold, but there was a slight stickiness in one spot near the knife block. When I pulled my hand away, my fingertips were tacky with something I couldn't identify. Another memory crashed over me, this one more vivid than the first. I was in the kitchen, but the lighting was different, harsher. Someone was behind me, breathing heavily, and I could feel their presence like heat radiating from a fire. There was the sound of metal against metal, sharp and final, then silence. I stumbled backward, knocking into the refrigerator. The impact sent several magnets clattering to the floor, along with the papers they had been holding. As I bent to pick them up, I saw that one was a letter addressed to my brother. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letter was brief and formal, something about a settlement and the need for his signature on certain documents. It was dated from the previous week, and there was a handwritten note in the margin, "Call immediately, time sensitive." I had never heard my brother mention any legal issues, any settlements or disputes that would require a lawyer's attention. He had always been careful with money, cautious about contracts and agreements. The existence of this letter suggested a whole side of his life I knew nothing about. The apartment seemed to shift around me. walls breathing in and out like living things. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the ceiling, amplified and distorted. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and I found myself gasping like a fish out of water. I needed to get out, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. The kitchen blurred at the edges, and I had the sensation of looking through water, everything rippling and uncertain. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, filling my nostrils and coating my tongue with its bitter taste. When my vision cleared, I was standing in the living room again, though I had no memory of walking there. The couch where I had been sitting was different now. The cushions were askew, and there was a dark stain on the armrest that definitely hadn't been there before. I approached slowly, afraid of what I might find. The stain was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, and it had soaked deep into the fabric. When I touched it, my fingers came away slightly damp and discolored. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I pulled out my own phone to call the police, but when I looked at the screen, I saw something that made no sense. According to the display, I had been in the apartment for over 6 hours, though it felt like I had just arrived. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the windows. The quality of light had changed completely. From the bright afternoon glow I remembered to this dusky, amber twilight. How had so much time passed without my awareness? I tried to retrace my steps, to remember exactly what I had done since arriving, but the memories were fragmented and contradictory. I remembered sitting in the chair reading, but I couldn't recall the title of the book or even opening it. I remembered searching the bedroom, but now I wasn't sure if the bed had been made or unmade. The phone in my hand felt foreign, heavier than it should be. When I tried to dial, my fingers wouldn't cooperate, pressing the wrong numbers, sliding off the screen. It was as if my body was operating independently of my mind, following some script I hadn't been given. A sound from the hallway made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the apartment door. I held my breath, listening as they stopped right outside. The doorknob turned with a soft click, and I realized with growing horror that I had never locked the door behind me when I entered. But no one came in. The footsteps retreated, fading down the hallway until silence returned. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole, but the corridor was empty, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. When I turned back to the apartment, everything had changed again. The furniture was in different positions, the books on the shelves were rearranged, and there were personal items I didn't recognize scattered around the room. A woman's scarf draped over the back of a chair, a pair of earrings on the coffee table, a lipstick tube that had rolled under the couch. My brother had never mentioned a girlfriend, never brought anyone to family gatherings or talked about dating. Yet here was evidence of a female presence, items that suggested intimacy and familiarity with the space. I picked up the scarf, and immediately a flood of sensations overwhelmed me. Perfume, light and floral, the sound of laughter, bright and musical, the feeling of fabric sliding between fingers, and underneath it all something darker, fear, sharp and metallic, cutting through the pleasant memories like a blade. The apartment was telling me a story, but in a language I didn't understand. Every object seemed to hold secrets, every surface whispered of events I couldn't quite grasp. I was a detective in my own life, investigating a crime I wasn't sure had been committed. The logical part of my mind insisted there was a rational explanation for everything. My brother had a girlfriend he hadn't mentioned. They had gone away together, forgetting his phone in their haste to leave. The stains and smells were innocent household accidents, magnified by my anxiety and imagination. But the other part of my mind, the part that operated below conscious thought, knew better. It recognized the signs, the patterns, the subtle wrongness that pervaded every inch of the space. Something had happened here, something that had changed the fundamental nature of the apartment from a home into something else entirely. As darkness fell outside, the shadows inside grew longer and more distorted. The familiar became alien, and I found myself a stranger in a place I thought I knew. The truth was here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to piece together the fragments and see the whole picture. But truth, I was beginning to understand, was not always something you could bear to see clearly. Sometimes the mind protects itself by creating alternative narratives, softer stories that allow you to sleep at night. Sometimes the most important question is not what really happened, but what you can live with believing. I stood at the threshold, key in hand, knowing that once I locked that door behind me, I would have to choose which version of events to carry forward. The apartment held its breath, waiting for my decision, and I realized that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Story 5. The vanishing point. The initial assessment indicated all entry points were barricaded. The main corridor exhibited a sharp decline in sound dampening, yet no disturbances were perceptible. Furniture maintained precise alignment, devoid of personal effects or external interference. An overturned chair rested near the window, whose lock remained unbroken. Layers of dust on undisturbed surfaces suggested prolonged vacancy, though the air carried a faint scent of detergent. A solitary photograph was placed face down on the desk, untouched by visible hands. All previously reported inhabitants remain unaccounted for. I've read these words so many times they've burned themselves into my memory. The official report sits before me now, its edges yellowed and soft from handling. My fingers trace the typewritten letters as I wonder, not for the first time, what details were left out. What didn't make it into this sterile summary of a scene that has haunted me for months. The case file landed on my desk on a morning that felt no different from any other. I was a private investigator then, working mostly insurance fraud and missing persons cases. Nothing that kept me awake at night, nothing like this. The woman who hired me spoke in whispers, her hands never quite still. She wore gloves despite the warm weather, leather ones that creaked when she moved. Her sister had vanished, she said, along with her brother-in-law and their teenage daughter. The whole family gone without a trace from their suburban home. The police had investigated, filed their reports, and moved on to fresher cases, but she couldn't let it go. Something happened in that house, she told me, her voice barely audible above the hum of my office air conditioning. I can feel it. I should have asked more questions then, should have pressed her about why she waited so long to hire someone, why the family had been estranged, why she seemed so afraid of her own shadow. Instead, I took her money and her key to the house, and I promised to find answers. The first time I entered the house, the silence hit me like a physical weight. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty building, but something heavier, more deliberate. My footsteps echoed strangely in the hallway, as if the walls were absorbing sound in uneven patches. The overturned chair by the window drew my attention immediately. It seemed too deliberate, too staged, like someone had placed it there as a message I couldn't decode. I spent hours in that first visit, photographing everything, making notes, trying to understand the geography of disappearance. The beds were made with military precision. The refrigerator still hummed, though it contained only condiments and a carton of milk that had expired weeks before the family was reported missing. In the daughter's room, textbooks lay open on the desk, a half-finished essay about social justice movements still glowing on her laptop screen. But it was the photograph on the father's desk that disturbed me most. face down, as the report noted, but when I carefully lifted it, I found myself staring at a family portrait that seemed wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The smiles were too wide, the poses too rigid. The mother's hand rested on her daughter's shoulder with what looked like possessive pressure. The father stood slightly apart, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera lens. I photographed the picture and replaced it exactly as I'd found it. Something told me the position mattered. The neighbors were reluctant to talk at first. The family had kept to themselves, they said, quiet people. The father worked from home, something in finance. The mother volunteered at local charities. The daughter was a good student, though she'd grown increasingly withdrawn in recent months. Normal suburban family living a normal suburban life until they weren't. But as I pressed deeper, cracks began to appear in the narrative. The woman next door mentioned hearing raised voices through the thin walls that separated their properties. Not arguments exactly, but intense conversations that went on late into the night. The man across the street had noticed the father leaving at odd hours, sometimes not returning until dawn. The family's mail had been piling up for days before anyone thought to call the authorities. There was something about that house, the elderly woman who lived 3 doors down told me. She invited me in for coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. It felt wrong. I used to walk my dog past there every morning, and he would always pull away from their yard. Animals know things we don't. She paused, staring into her cup. The last week before they disappeared, I saw lights moving around inside at all hours. Not normal lights, but flashlights or candles, like they were searching for something or hiding something. I asked her if she'd told the police about this. She nodded, but said they dismissed it as the observations of a lonely old woman with too much time on her hands. Back at the house, I began to notice details that hadn't made it into the official report. Scratches around the locks on the bedroom doors as if they'd been picked or forced. A section of carpet in the living room that had been cleaned so thoroughly it was a different shade from the rest. The basement door, which was locked from the outside with a heavy deadbolt that looked newly installed. The basement key wasn't on the ring the client had given me. When I asked her about it, she claimed not to know where it might be. Her reaction troubled me. She became agitated, insisting that the basement wasn't important, that her sister's family never used it for anything but storage. But if it was just storage, why the heavy lock? Why the evasiveness? I spent the next several days trying to track down the family's history. What I found painted a picture that contradicted everything I'd been told. The father had been investigated for financial irregularities at his previous job. Nothing criminal, but enough to raise questions about his character. The mother had been treated for severe anxiety and depression, with multiple hospitalizations over the past 5 years. The daughter had been suspended from school twice for fighting, and her social media presence revealed a girl struggling with anger and isolation. This wasn't the perfect family that had been described to me. This was a unit under severe stress, possibly breaking apart from within. The breakthrough came when I discovered the family had been receiving threatening letters. Not death threats exactly, but messages that suggested someone knew secrets they wanted to keep hidden. The letters were unsigned, written in block letters on generic paper. They referenced debts that must be paid and truths that will come to light. I found the letters hidden behind a loose baseboard in the master bedroom, wrapped in plastic and duct taped to the wall. 23 letters in total, spanning 6 months. The tone grew increasingly urgent with each one. The final letter, dated just days before the disappearance, contained only 5 words: "Time is running out now." The handwriting analysis I commissioned came back inconclusive. The letters could have been written by anyone, including someone in the family itself. That possibility hadn't occurred to me initially, but as I studied the messages more carefully, I began to wonder if this was an elaborate deception designed to cover up something else entirely. I returned to the client with my findings. She listened to my report with growing agitation, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. When I mentioned the threatening letters, she went pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. "My sister would have told me if someone was threatening them." But would she have? From everything I'd learned, the family had been increasingly isolated in their final months. The sister hadn't spoken to my client in over a year before the disappearance. Their relationship had been strained by old grievances and recent arguments about money. Money, that was another thread I'd been pulling. The family's financial records showed significant irregularities. Large cash withdrawals, closed accounts, assets that had been liquidated quietly over several months. Someone had been preparing for something, flight perhaps, or payment of some kind of debt. The father's computer revealed encrypted files I couldn't access and a browsing history that had been carefully scrubbed. But fragments remained, breadcrumbs that suggested he'd been researching new identities, offshore accounts, and ways to disappear without leaving traces. The mother's phone contained deleted text messages that data recovery revealed to be increasingly frantic communications with someone identified only as M. "Please don't do this," one message read. "Think about what it will do to her." "We don't have a choice," came the reply. "It's the only way to keep everyone safe." The final message was sent just hours before the family was last seen. "It's done. God forgive us." I showed these messages to my client. She stared at the phone screen for a long time, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Who is M?" But I was beginning to suspect I knew. The client's first name, which I'd learned from the check she'd written me, began with M. Her middle name, which appeared on her identification, also began with M. She'd been evasive about her relationship with the family, about the timing of her concerns, about her knowledge of the house. I asked her directly about the text messages. She denied any knowledge of them, but her denial felt hollow. She was hiding something, and I was starting to understand that my investigation had been guided from the beginning towards specific conclusions while being steered away from others. That night I returned to the house alone. I'd had a locksmith make me a key for the basement door, despite my client's protests. If there were answers to be found, I suspected they lay behind that heavy deadbolt. The basement was not the storage area I'd expected. It was finished, carpeted, furnished like a secondary living space. A television, comfortable chairs, a small refrigerator, and evidence of recent habitation. The air held the faint scent of cleaning supplies mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. In the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, I found what looked like a makeshift grave. The concrete floor had been broken up and recently repaired. The patch was still slightly damp, and the smell was stronger there, much stronger. I should have called the police then, should have backed away and let the authorities handle what I'd found. Instead, I kept searching, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. In a storage cabinet, I discovered financial records that painted a clearer picture of the family's situation. The father had been embezzling money from his clients for years, significant amounts, enough to warrant serious criminal charges and prison time. But more disturbing were the insurance policies I found. Life insurance on all three family members, with my client listed as the primary beneficiary. policies that had been purchased just months before the disappearance, policies that would pay out substantial sums if the family was declared legally dead. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more complex than simple murder for insurance money. The threatening letters, the family's obvious preparation for flight, the staged nature of the scene upstairs. This felt like a collaboration rather than a crime, a plan that required participation from everyone involved. I photographed everything and left the basement exactly as I'd found it. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate movement across the floor I'd thought was empty. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The basement had been a dead zone, and my phone hadn't reconnected yet. I climbed the remaining stairs as quietly as possible and peered through the partially open door. My client stood in the living room, no longer wearing her gloves. Her hands were scarred, I noticed, old burn marks across her palms and fingers. She was studying the overturned chair by the window, adjusting its position slightly. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," she said without turning around. "You're more thorough than the police were." I stepped into the room, my hand on the door frame for support. "Where are they?" She turned then and her face was different, calmer, almost relieved. "Safe," she said, "safer than they would have been if they'd stayed." "Well, the basement is exactly what you think it is, but not what you think it means." She moved to the desk and picked up the face-down photograph, studying it with an expression I couldn't read. "My sister called me 6 months ago, terrified. Her husband's embezzling had been discovered. There were people looking for him, dangerous people who didn't care about collateral damage. The family had days, maybe hours, before those people found them." She set the photograph down, still face down. "So we made a plan. It had to look real, convincing enough that everyone would believe they were dead. The insurance money would pay back what he'd stolen, with enough left over for them to start new lives somewhere safe." "But the basement. Animal blood from a butcher shop 2 towns over. We needed it to smell right, to test right if anyone was thorough enough to look, which you were." I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. "You hired me to investigate your own crime. I hired you to legitimize it, to ask the right questions and find the right evidence, to create a paper trail that would satisfy the insurance companies when I filed the claims." She paused. "I didn't expect you to be quite so good at your job." "Where are they now?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I honestly don't know. That was part of the plan. I arranged their disappearance, but not their destination. It's safer for everyone that way." I thought about the family portrait, about the tension I'd sensed in their poses. They knew. When that picture was taken, they already knew what was going to happen. The photographer was a friend of mine. He took dozens of shots that day, but that was the only one where they all looked appropriately dead. We kept it as a reminder of what we were working toward. The room felt colder suddenly, as if her words had changed the very atmosphere. "You're confessing to insurance fraud, to faking deaths, to saving my sister's family from people who would have killed them for real." Her voice hardened. "To protecting a teenage girl from paying the price for her father's mistakes." I looked around the room, seeing it now with different eyes. The staged perfection, the deliberate clues, the carefully constructed mystery. It had all been theater, designed to create a convincing narrative of tragedy while hiding a story of survival. But something still bothered me. The threatening letters, the financial records, the basement, it's all too elaborate for a simple disappearance. She nodded because it wasn't simple. The people looking for my brother-in-law are thorough. They would have investigated, asked questions, looked for inconsistencies. We needed a story that would satisfy them as completely as it satisfied the police. And if they're not satisfied? Her expression darkened. Then my family dies for real. I left the house that night with more questions than answers. My client had asked me to write a final report confirming the family's death, to close the case officially and file the insurance claims. In exchange, she offered me a substantial bonus and her promise that no one would ever know what I discovered. But as I sat in my car outside the house, I wondered if I truly understood what I'd discovered. The story she'd told me made sense, but it felt incomplete. There were still gaps, still inconsistencies that nagged at me. The overturned chair, for instance. If the scene was staged, why that particular detail? It seemed random, purposeless, and the photograph face down on the desk. Why go to the trouble of positioning it so precisely if it was just meant to suggest abandonment? I started the engine but didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I sat there staring at the house, trying to decide what I believed. The evidence supported my client's story, but evidence could be manufactured, especially by someone who'd had months to plan and prepare. What if the family hadn't cooperated? What if the insurance fraud was real, but the survival story was fabricated to cover up actual murders? My client had been evasive from the beginning, had guided my investigation in specific directions while blocking others. She'd had access to the house, knowledge of the family's routines, and a substantial financial motive. The scarred hands I'd noticed troubled me too. Burn marks she'd claimed when I asked, from a kitchen accident years ago, but they looked more recent than that and more extensive. The kind of injuries someone might sustain while disposing of evidence or bodies. I drove home that night but couldn't sleep. The case file lay open on my kitchen table, and I found myself reading through it again, looking for details I might have missed. The official police report was thorough but not exhaustive. There were gaps in the timeline, witnesses who hadn't been interviewed, evidence that hadn't been collected. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of writing the report my client wanted, I called the detective who'd handled the original investigation. He was skeptical at first, dismissive of a private investigator's theories about a case he considered closed. But when I mentioned the basement and the insurance policies, his tone changed. "We'll meet you at the house in an hour," he said. I arrived first, using my key to let myself in. The house felt different in the morning light, less mysterious, more ordinary. But the basement still held its secrets, and the smell was stronger than I remembered. The detective arrived with a crime scene team and a search warrant. What they found beneath the patched concrete changed everything again. Not human remains as I'd expected, but something else entirely. A metal box containing documents, photographs, and recordings that painted a picture of a family living in terror. Not from external threats, as my client had claimed, but from something much closer to home. The recordings were the most disturbing. Conversations between family members made secretly and saved as insurance against future violence. The father's voice pleading for forgiveness. The mother threatening to expose everything if the abuse didn't stop. The daughter sobbing as she described years of manipulation and fear. And through it all, a fourth voice. My client, not as the protective sister she'd claimed to be, but as the architect of the family's suffering. The recordings revealed a pattern of psychological and financial abuse stretching back years. She'd been embezzling from her brother-in-law's business, using the stolen money to maintain control over the family. When they'd finally worked up the courage to expose her, she'd threatened to destroy them all. The disappearance hadn't been a rescue operation. It had been the final act of a long campaign of terror. But where were the bodies? The detective asked me the same question I'd been asking myself. If my client had killed her sister's family, what had she done with the remains? The basement had yielded evidence of planning and motive, but no physical proof of murder. The answer came from an unexpected source. The elderly neighbor who'd noticed the strange lights in the house contacted the police after seeing the crime scene vehicles. She had something else to report, she said, something she'd been afraid to mention before. The night before the family disappeared, she'd seen my client loading large bags into a van behind the house. Heavy bags that required significant effort to move. The neighbor had assumed it was garbage or donations to charity. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The van was registered to a rental company under a false name, but security cameras at the rental location provided clear images of my client picking it up and returning it. GPS data from the vehicle led investigators to a remote area outside town where cadaver dogs detected the scent of human remains. But when they excavated the site, they found only animal bones, the same type of bones that might be used to stage a crime scene and create convincing evidence of death. I realized then that I'd been manipulated from the very beginning. My client hadn't hired me to investigate her family's disappearance. She'd hired me to create a believable story that would satisfy both the authorities and the dangerous people who'd been looking for her brother-in-law. The threatening letters, the financial irregularities, the staged crime scene. All of it had been designed to make me reach the conclusions she wanted. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. She'd helped her family disappear, but not to save them, to control them. They were alive somewhere, but not free. They were prisoners of her protection, dependent on her for their new identities, their financial support, their very survival. The insurance policies would never pay out because the deaths could never be proven. But that had never been the real goal. The goal had been to make her family disappear so completely that they could never expose her crimes or escape her influence. I never saw my client again after that morning in the house. She vanished as thoroughly as her family had, leaving behind only questions and a growing certainty that justice, in this case, would remain forever elusive. The official investigation continues, but without bodies or definitive proof of murder, there's little hope of prosecution. The family remains missing, their fate unknown. My client remains free, probably living under a new identity in a new place, possibly still controlling the lives of the people she claimed to save. I've written this account not as a final report, but as a warning. Sometimes the people who hire us to find the truth are the ones with the most to hide. Sometimes the victims and the perpetrators are impossible to distinguish. And sometimes the only certainty is that we'll never know for certain what really happened in that quiet suburban house where a family vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that multiply with every answer we think we've found. The overturned chair still haunts my dreams. Such a small detail, but it represented everything wrong with the case. Staged but authentic, meaningful but inexplicable. Like the family itself, it existed in a space between truth and fiction, between salvation and destruction, where nothing was quite what it seemed, and everything was exactly what it appeared to be. Story 6. It felt like the brush of paper against skin. Soft, barely noticeable, yet insistent enough to anchor me where I stood next to a window suffused with early morning haze. I glanced at the empty table, a place usually marked by newspapers or mail, now disturbingly bare. The sensation returned, gentle and precise, and my heart quickened. It emanated from the corner by the bookshelf where dust motes danced lazily. The room seemed smaller, the air denser, pulling me toward a book that wasn't quite in place. It was a feeling I shouldn't know, a reminder of rooms I hadn't entered in years, but the sensation lingered, refusing to be forgotten. I knew exactly what had happened that morning. The certainty felt as solid as the floorboards beneath my feet. My neighbor had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The evidence was right there in my living room, the displaced book, the empty table, the way the morning light caught particles of dust that shouldn't have been disturbed. Someone had been in my house while I slept. The police had been polite but skeptical when I called. No signs of forced entry, they said. Nothing missing as far as I could tell, but I knew better. I'd lived in this house for over a decade, and I could sense when something was wrong the way a musician notices a piano key slightly out of tune. The detective who came by was young, probably fresh out of training, with eyes that said he'd heard this story before from paranoid homeowners jumping at shadows. But this wasn't paranoia, this was methodical. Someone had moved through my space with surgical precision, touching just enough to let me know they'd been there without leaving obvious traces. The book, a collection of poetry I hadn't touched in months, had been pulled out exactly 1 inch from the shelf. The table had been cleared of the stack of unopened mail I'd left there the night before. My coffee mug, which I always left on the kitchen counter, sat clean and dry in the dishwasher. My neighbor had been watching me for weeks. I'd caught glimpses of curtains twitching when I came home from work, shadows moving past windows at odd hours, a figure standing in the backyard garden just long enough for me to notice before disappearing. The harassment had been escalating, and this break-in was the next logical step. I documented everything in a notebook I kept hidden in my bedroom drawer. Dates, times, descriptions of suspicious behavior. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. The police might not take me seriously now, but they would when I presented them with months of evidence. This wasn't random. This was personal. The certainty carried me through the first few hours after discovery. I dusted surfaces for fingerprints with a kit I'd ordered online. I checked every window latch, every door frame, searching for the point of entry I knew must exist. I called a locksmith to change the deadbolts and install a security system. Action felt good. Action felt like taking control. But as the day wore on, small details began to nag at me like splinters under the skin. The mail I was certain had been on the table. When exactly had I seen it there? I remembered bringing it in from the mailbox, but the memory felt gauzy, imprecise. Had it been yesterday evening or the day before? The image in my mind showed me setting the envelopes down, but the harder I tried to focus on the specifics, the more the memory seemed to shift and blur. I found the mail eventually, sitting in its usual spot on the kitchen counter where I always sorted it. The envelopes looked exactly as I remembered them, still unopened, still in the same order, but I could have sworn I'd left them on the living room table. The certainty that had felt so solid began to develop hairline cracks. The coffee mug troubled me too. I always left it on the counter, unwashed, a habit that annoyed me but one I never seemed to break. Finding it clean in the dishwasher had been one of my key pieces of evidence. But when I really thought about it, I couldn't remember drinking coffee the previous morning. I'd been running late for an early meeting, hadn't I? Maybe I'd skipped my usual routine entirely. The young detective's questions echoed in my memory with uncomfortable persistence. When did you last see the items in question? Are you certain about the timeline? Have you been under any unusual stress lately? His tone had been professional, but I'd caught something else underneath, not quite pity, but a kind of weary recognition. I pulled out my notebook and flipped through the documented incidents. The entries were all there in my own handwriting, but reading them now, they seemed less compelling than they had when I'd written them. Curtains moved at kitchen window 3:47 p.m., but curtains moved in the breeze all the time, didn't they? Figure in backyard approximately 10:20 p.m., but the backyard was visible from 3 different houses, and any number of people had legitimate reasons to be there. The sensation that had started everything, that brush of paper against skin, returned as I sat reviewing my notes. It was strongest near the bookshelf, just as it had been that morning. I approached slowly, trying to understand what my body was telling me. The feeling intensified as I reached for the poetry book, the one I was certain had been moved. I pulled it from the shelf completely this time, and something fluttered to the floor. A photograph, old and slightly yellowed at the edges. I bent to retrieve it, and my breath caught in my throat. The image showed my living room, but not as it was now. The furniture was arranged differently, the walls painted a color I didn't remember. And there, sitting in a chair that was no longer in the room, was a person I recognized but couldn't quite place. The face was familiar in the way that makes you search your memory frantically, knowing the answer is just beyond reach. I turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written a single word: remember. The handwriting looked like mine. I sat down heavily, the photograph trembling in my hands. When had I taken this picture? When had I hidden it in a book I never read? The living room in the image was definitely this room, but it was also somehow not. Like looking at a place you'd lived in a dream, recognizable but wrong in ways you couldn't articulate. The person in the chair, I knew that face, but every time I tried to focus on the features, they seemed to slip away from me like water through my fingers. Young or old, male or female, the harder I looked, the more uncertain I became. I walked to the window where I'd stood that morning, photograph still in hand. The early light had been replaced by afternoon shadows, but the view was the same. Or was it? The neighbor's house across the street looked different somehow. Had the shutters always been that color? Had there always been a garden gnome by the front steps? My notebook felt heavier as I picked it up again. The handwriting was definitely mine. I recognized the way I crossed my T's, the slight leftward slant of my letters. But the voice in these entries sounded like someone else. Someone paranoid and frightened, jumping at ordinary sounds and innocent movements. Someone who saw threats in every shadow. Watched from bedroom window for 45 minutes, read one entry. No movement detected, but presence felt strongly. Had I really spent 45 minutes staring out a window at nothing? The memory was there, but it felt borrowed, like something I'd heard about rather than experienced myself. I flipped backward through the notebook, looking for the first entry. The handwriting grew progressively shakier as I went further back, the observations more fragmented. Can't sleep, they're getting closer. Found door unlocked again. No, I locked it. The smell is back, sweet and chemical, coming from the walls. I didn't remember writing any of this. The photograph seemed to pulse in my other hand, warm against my palm. I looked at it again, and this time the face in the chair was clearer. It was me, but younger, much younger. I was smiling at whoever held the camera, completely relaxed and happy in a way I couldn't remember feeling in years. But if I was in the photograph who had taken it? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. I searched the image for clues, a reflection in a window, a shadow on the wall, anything that might reveal the photographer's identity. But there was nothing. Just me, sitting in a chair I no longer owned, in a room that was mine but not mine, smiling at someone I couldn't remember. I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. How long had I lived here? The question should have been simple, but the answer felt slippery. I could remember moving in, boxes and furniture, and the exhaustion of starting over. But when the memory had no anchor in time, no reference point to fix it in place. The walls were covered with photographs, but now I noticed they were all landscapes, empty rooms, objects without people. No family pictures, no friends, no evidence of relationships or connections. Had I removed them at some point, hidden them away like the photograph in the book? In the kitchen, I opened drawers and cabinets with the systematic thoroughness of a detective searching a crime scene. Everything was neat, organized, exactly where it should be, but underneath the order I sensed something else. Spaces where things had been removed, gaps in the arrangement that spoke of absence. The refrigerator was covered with takeout menus and appointment cards, but no personal photos or mementos. I pulled one of the appointment cards down and studied it. A doctor's office I didn't recognize, for a visit I couldn't remember. The handwriting on the card wasn't mine. The sensation of paper against skin returned, stronger now. It seemed to be guiding me, pulling me toward discoveries I wasn't sure I wanted to make. I followed it upstairs to my bedroom, to the drawer where I kept the notebook. Inside, beneath the documentation of my neighbor's supposed harassment, I found more photographs. Dozens of them, all showing the same living room in different configurations. The furniture moved, the decorations changed, but always that same chair in the center, and always me sitting in it. In some I looked happy, in others confused or frightened. In the most recent ones, I looked like I was sleeping. Or unconscious. Each photograph had writing on the back, dates, but not in any chronological order I could follow. Notes like progress slow but steady, and memory gaps increasing as expected, and subject responding well to environmental manipulation. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was careful, clinical, like a doctor's notes in a patient file. I sat on the bed, photographs scattered around me like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to solve. The notebook lay open beside me, filled with observations that made less sense with every reading. Had I been documenting harassment or something else entirely? The house felt different now, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the light seemed significant. I was no longer sure if I was the victim or the subject, the observer or the observed. The neighbor I'd been so certain was stalking me, when had I last actually seen them? I tried to remember a face, a conversation, any direct interaction, but found only impressions. Movements at windows, figures in shadows, the sense of being watched. But no concrete encounters, no words exchanged, no proof that this person existed outside my own perception. What if the break-in hadn't been a break-in at all? What if someone with legitimate access had been moving through my house, documenting changes, monitoring my responses? The thought made my skin crawl, but it explained so much. The lack of forced entry, the subtle nature of the disturbances, the way everything seemed designed to make me notice without providing clear evidence. I thought about the young detective's questions with new understanding. He hadn't been skeptical of my story, he'd been trying to assess my mental state. The way he'd looked around the house, noting details I hadn't paid attention to at the time. The careful way he'd phrased his questions about stress and timeline and certainty. Had this happened before, had I called the police with similar complaints, convinced each time that this was the first incident, the beginning of a pattern I was just starting to recognize? The photographs suggested a longer timeline than I could consciously access. Months, maybe years of documentation. Someone had been very patient, very thorough, but who and why? I walked back downstairs, seeing the living room as if for the first time. The bookshelf where I'd found the first photograph was positioned to be visible from multiple angles. The table that had been so conspicuously empty now seemed deliberately staged. Even the window where I'd stood that morning offered a perfect view of the entire room. Like an observation deck, like a performance space. The sensation of paper against skin had faded, replaced by something heavier. A weight in my chest that might have been fear or might have been recognition. The truth was somewhere in this house, in these photographs, in the gaps between my memories, but did I really want to find it? Outside, evening was approaching. The light through the windows grew softer, more golden. Soon it would be dark, and I would be alone with my questions and my discoveries. Alone, or under observation, I was no longer sure there was a difference. I gathered the photographs and arranged them on the living room table, trying to find a pattern, a progression that might explain what had been done to me and why. But the more I studied them, the more questions arose. In some, I appeared to be posing willingly. In others, I looked surprised by the camera. And in a few, I seemed to be taking the pictures myself, my arm extended toward the camera, my reflection visible in a mirror at the edge of the frame. What if I had been documenting my own condition? What if the clinical notes were my own attempts to track changes I could sense but not remember? The possibility was almost more disturbing than the idea of an outside observer. It suggested a level of self-awareness coupled with helplessness that made my current confusion feel like a mercy. The notebook lay open beside the photographs, my handwriting growing progressively more erratic as I flipped through the pages. But was it deteriorating or improving? Was I documenting a decline or a recovery? Without a clear timeline, without anchored memories, it was impossible to know which direction the story was moving. The house around me felt like a stage set, carefully arranged to trigger specific responses. But whether those responses were therapeutic or experimental, whether I was being helped or studied, remained unclear. The line between treatment and research had blurred beyond recognition. As darkness settled outside the windows, I realized that tomorrow morning I might wake up and find evidence of another intrusion. Another book displaced, another familiar object in an unfamiliar location. And I might feel that same certainty I'd felt this morning, that same conviction that I knew exactly what was happening and who was responsible. But now I understood that certainty itself might be part of the design. The feeling of knowing, of being in control of the narrative, might be as carefully constructed as everything else in my environment. How many times had I discovered these photographs? How many times had I questioned my memories and reached these same uncomfortable conclusions? The sensation that had started it all, that brush of paper against skin, returned one final time as I sat surrounded by evidence I couldn't fully interpret. It felt like a signature, a calling card left by someone who wanted to be found but not identified. Someone who understood that the most effective way to hide the truth was to let me discover it myself over and over, in a cycle I might never be able to break. I looked at the photographs again, at my face changing subtly from image to image, and wondered if tomorrow I would remember any of this. Or if I would wake up clean and certain, ready to begin the investigation all over again, following clues that led inevitably back to questions I had no way to answer. The truth felt close and impossibly distant at the same time, like trying to grab smoke with bare hands. And in the growing darkness of my living room, surrounded by evidence of a mystery I might be solving for the 100th time, I began to understand that some questions are designed never to be fully answered, only endlessly, hypnotically explored. Story 7. The weight of small things. It wasn't unusual for the window to be open. Papers on the desk fluttered slightly, a barely noticeable sign that the air was unsettled. I picked up a stack of files, feeling their weight but not their significance. The blinds swung in a soft, lazy rhythm, almost hypnotic. It was easy to overlook the small things, like the way the frame didn't quite close anymore. I didn't check to see if I was alone before I left. It seemed unnecessary by then. But that was before I understood what those files contained, before I learned that the window hadn't been opened from the inside. I'd been working as a records clerk for the county office for what felt like forever, filing away the forgotten pieces of other people's lives. Insurance claims, property transfers, court documents that no one would ever read again. The work was methodical, peaceful in its monotony. I thought I knew every corner of that building, every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the afternoon light. The first file that caught my attention was misfiled, tucked between property deeds from different decades. The paper felt different under my fingertips, slightly thicker, with a texture that seemed to resist being handled. Inside was a single photograph and a brief report about a missing person case that had been closed without resolution. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. Her eyes held a warmth that made me pause longer than I should have. The report was sparse. She had disappeared from her apartment on a Tuesday evening. No signs of struggle. Personal belongings left behind, including her purse and identification. The investigating officer noted that neighbors reported hearing voices through the walls earlier that day, but no one could identify who might have been visiting. The case was classified as voluntary disappearance after 3 months of investigation yielded no substantial leads. I almost returned the file to its proper place, almost. Instead, I found myself studying the photograph again. There was something about her expression, a subtle tension around her eyes that contradicted the smile. I'd seen that look before, though I couldn't place where. The feeling nagged at me as I continued my work, sorting through decades of bureaucratic debris. That evening I drove past the address listed in the report. The apartment building was ordinary, the kind of place where people lived quietly and kept to themselves. Most of the windows were dark, but I could see the faint glow of television screens in some units. I sat in my car, engine running, wondering what had possessed me to come here. The woman in the photograph had been missing for over 2 years. Whatever had happened to her was long settled, filed away and forgotten by everyone who mattered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen her face somewhere else. The next morning I arrived at work early and went straight to the archive room. The building felt different in the pre-dawn quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I pulled files methodically, searching for any other mention of the missing woman. Her name appeared in 3 other documents: a lease agreement, a small claims court filing, and a witness statement in an unrelated case. The witness statement made my hands tremble slightly as I read it. She had reported seeing a man loitering near the elementary school, watching children during dismissal. The report was filed just 2 weeks before her disappearance. The description she gave was detailed, specific. She had been observant, careful to note the man's clothing, his approximate age, even the way he stood with one shoulder slightly raised. I photocopied the statement and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The paper felt warm against my chest as I worked through the rest of my shift, processing routine documents that seemed suddenly meaningless. During my lunch break, I called the police department and asked to speak with someone about the missing person case. The desk sergeant transferred me twice before I reached a detective who remembered the file. His voice was tired, professionally distant. "Cold case," he said. "We followed every lead we had. Sometimes people just walk away from their lives. It happens more than you think." "What about the witness statement she filed?" about the man at the school. There was a pause. What witness statement? I described the document I'd found, reading him the case number. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "That's not in our file," he said finally. "Are you sure you have the right case number?" I was sure. I checked it 3 times after hanging up the phone, comparing the numbers on both documents. They matched perfectly. That afternoon, I made another discovery that changed everything. While processing a batch of employment records, I found a personnel file for a maintenance worker who had been terminated shortly after the woman's disappearance. The reason for termination was listed as failure to return equipment. The equipment in question was a set of master keys to several apartment complexes in the area, including the building where she had lived. The man's photograph was attached to his employment record. Even in the grainy black and white image, I recognized him immediately. He matched the description from the witness statement exactly, down to the raised shoulder and the way his eyes seemed to avoid direct contact with the camera. I spent the rest of the afternoon fighting the urge to leave work early. My hands shook slightly as I processed routine paperwork, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at the archive room door. The building's familiar sounds seemed amplified: footsteps in distant hallways, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft whisper of papers being shuffled. When my shift ended, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the address listed on the terminated employee's file. The house was small, set back from the street behind an overgrown hedge. Windows were covered with heavy curtains, and newspapers had accumulated on the front porch. A sign in the yard indicated the property was for rent. I knocked anyway, though I expected no answer. The sound echoed hollowly inside the empty house. As I turned to leave, a neighbor emerged from the house next door, an elderly man with suspicious eyes. "Nobody's lived there for months," he said. "Owner had to gut the place after what happened." "What happened?" He studied my face carefully before answering. Police came by several times asking questions. Then one day hazmat trucks showed up. Took them 2 days to haul everything out. Carpet, floorboards, even some of the drywall. Place smelled terrible for weeks afterward. My mouth felt dry. "Do you know when this was?" "Right around the time that girl went missing, the one from the apartments down the road." He gestured vaguely toward the woman's former neighborhood. "Never did find her, did they?" I thanked him and returned to my car, but I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I sat in the growing darkness, processing what I'd learned. The timeline was too convenient to be coincidental. A maintenance worker with access to apartment keys disappears around the same time as a woman who had reported suspicious behavior. Police investigate both cases separately, apparently unaware of the connection. Or maybe they were aware, and the connection had been deliberately obscured. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the misfiled document, how it had been placed exactly where I would find it while processing routine paperwork. The more I considered it, the more deliberate it seemed. Someone had wanted that file to be discovered, but not through official channels. I returned to work the next morning with a new sense of purpose. If someone was using me to expose information that had been buried, I needed to understand why. I spent my lunch break in the archive room, pulling files related to the maintenance company that had employed the missing man. What I found made my blood run cold. The company had contracts with dozens of properties throughout the county: apartment complexes, office buildings, schools. Their employees had access to nearly every public and private space in the area, and according to the employment records I found, 3 other workers had been terminated for missing equipment over the past 5 years. Each termination had occurred shortly after a missing person report was filed. Each missing person had lived or worked in a building serviced by the company. I photocopied everything, my hands shaking as I fed documents through the machine. The copies were slightly off-center, betraying my nervousness, but they were legible. I tucked them into a manila envelope and sealed it carefully. As I prepared to leave the archive room, I noticed something that made me freeze. The window was open again, just as it had been that first day, but I distinctly remembered closing it before I began my research. The blinds swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, casting shifting shadows across the floor. I approached the window cautiously and examined the frame. There were fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, as if someone had forced it open from the outside, but we were on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no balcony, no way to reach this window without specialized equipment. Unless someone had a key to the building. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the only person with access to these files. Maintenance workers came and went freely, often after regular business hours. They could enter any room, examine any document without arousing suspicion. They were invisible, trusted, overlooked. Just like I had been until now. I left the building immediately, clutching the envelope of photocopied documents. My car felt exposed in a parking lot, too visible from the office windows above. I drove aimlessly for several minutes before pulling into a crowded shopping center where I could blend in with other vehicles. I needed to think clearly to decide what to do with the information I'd gathered. The logical step would be to contact the police, but my earlier conversation with the detective had revealed that crucial evidence was missing from their files. Either their investigation had been incompetent, or someone had deliberately removed information. Instead, I decided to visit the families of the missing persons. If there were connections the police had missed, the families might remember details that hadn't made it into official reports. The first address belonged to the parents of a young man who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Their house was modest but well maintained, with children's toys scattered across the front lawn. A woman answered the door, her face immediately guarded when I introduced myself and explained why I'd come. "We don't talk about that anymore," she said. "It's been too long, we've moved on." But she didn't close the door, and I could see the pain in her eyes that suggested she hadn't moved on at all. "I found some documents that might be connected to your son's case," I said gently. "I think there might be information that the police overlooked." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me enter. The living room was filled with family photographs, including several of a young man with kind eyes and an easy smile. He looked like someone who would have been popular, well-liked, with no reason to simply vanish from his life. "He was supposed to start a new job," she said, settling into a chair across from me. "Security guard at one of the office complexes downtown. Good pay, benefits, he was excited about it." "Did he ever mention problems with his apartment, issues with maintenance or repairs?" Her expression changed subtly. "How did you know about that? He'd been complaining for weeks about his air conditioning. The maintenance man kept coming by, but it never seemed to get fixed. My son said the guy gave him the creeps, always found excuses to come inside and look around." I showed her the employment records I'd copied, pointing out the dates and the pattern I'd discovered. She studied the documents carefully, her face growing pale. "This man," she said, pointing to one of the termination records, This is him. I saw him at my son's apartment once when I was visiting. He had keys to everything, said he was checking all the units in the building, but he spent a lot of time in my son's place asking personal questions. What kind of questions? About my son's schedule, whether he lived alone, if he had a girlfriend. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly. Now, she trailed off, staring at the photograph attached to the employment record. I left her house with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that I was on the right track. The pattern was becoming clearer. Vulnerable people living alone, targeted by someone with unlimited access to their homes. Someone who could study their routines, learn their habits, and strike when they were most isolated. But I still didn't understand why the evidence had been scattered and hidden, or why someone had wanted me to find it. The answer came that evening when I returned to my apartment and found my door slightly ajar. I lived alone, and I was obsessively careful about locking up when I left. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, listening for sounds from inside, but heard only the familiar hum of my refrigerator and the distant murmur of television from neighboring units. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but as I moved through the rooms, I noticed subtle signs of disturbance. Books shifted slightly on shelves, drawers not quite closed all the way, papers on my desk arranged differently than I'd left them. Someone had searched my apartment methodically and professionally, taking care not to leave obvious signs of intrusion. But they had missed one detail. I always left a single hair stretched across the inside of my closet door, invisible unless you knew to look for it. The hair was gone. I checked my hiding places carefully. The envelope of photocopied documents was still taped under my kitchen table, but the tape had been disturbed and reapplied. Someone had found and examined the evidence I'd gathered, then left it in place. They wanted me to know they had been here. That night I sat in my living room with all the lights off, watching the street through a gap in my curtains. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping across my walls before disappearing into the darkness. I thought about the missing people, about families who would never have answers, about a system that had failed to protect the most vulnerable. And I thought about the person who had led me to this information, who remained invisible while manipulating events from the shadows. The next morning I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the maintenance company more thoroughly. Using public records and online databases, I traced its ownership through a maze of shell corporations and holding companies. The true owner was a man whose name appeared in connection with several other businesses that provided services requiring access to private spaces, cleaning companies, security firms, property management groups. He had built an empire of invisibility, employing people who could move freely through other people's lives without attracting attention. But one of those employees had developed a conscience, and now they were using me to expose what they couldn't reveal directly. I returned to work the following day, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the building. The archive room felt different now, charged with tension and possibility. I continued my regular duties while watching for signs of surveillance or interference. It came during my afternoon break. I found a new file on my desk, placed exactly where I would notice it immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address and a time written in careful block letters, nothing else. The address was for a storage facility on the outskirts of town. The time was after sunset, when the place would be mostly deserted. I knew it was dangerous to go alone. but I also knew that this might be my only chance to learn the truth. I spent the remainder of my shift making copies of everything I discovered and mailing them to a reporter at the local newspaper, along with a letter explaining the connections I'd found. If something happened to me, at least the story would survive. The storage facility was exactly as I'd expected. Rows of metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing, security lights casting harsh shadows across empty pavement. I found the specified unit number and discovered it was already open, the roll-up door raised just high enough for a person to duck underneath. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to leave, but I had come too far to turn back now. Inside, the unit was filled with boxes, filing cabinets, and personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to any single individual. Photographs, identification cards, jewelry, clothing, the accumulated possessions of people who had vanished without explanation. And sitting on a folding chair in the center of it all was a man I recognized from the employment records. Not the terminated maintenance worker, but his supervisor. The person who had hired him, who had provided him with access and opportunity, who had covered his tracks when suspicion began to fall. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," he said calmly. "You've been very thorough in your research. You're the one who's been leaving me the files." He nodded. I couldn't let it continue, but I also couldn't expose it directly without implicating myself. I needed someone else to discover the pattern, someone who would ask the right questions. "How many people?" 17 over the past 8 years, maybe more. I stopped keeping precise count after the first dozen. The number hit me like a physical blow. 17 lives, 17 families destroyed, 17 cases that had been allowed to go cold because the evidence had been systematically obscured. "Why didn't you just go to the police?" His laugh was bitter. "You think this operation existed without official protection. You think files disappear from police evidence rooms by accident." He gestured toward the boxes surrounding us. "This is just one storage unit. There are others in different locations. Insurance policies in case anyone gets too curious." I understood then that I had been manipulated from the beginning, led through a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to serve someone else's purposes. But I also understood that the information I'd gathered was real, and the people who had died deserved justice, even if it came through deception. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you leave, you forget this address, forget this conversation. You've already mailed your evidence to the newspaper. Let them investigate, let them ask the official questions. Your part in this is finished." But as I turned to go, I realized that my part would never truly be finished. I would always know that somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery I served, there were people who traded in human lives, who used their positions of trust to prey on the vulnerable. And I would always wonder how many other misfiled documents were waiting to be discovered. How many other patterns remained hidden in the endless stacks of forgotten paperwork. The storage unit door rolled down behind me with a metallic crash that echoed across the empty facility. I drove home through streets that looked the same as always but felt fundamentally changed, as if I were seeing them through different eyes. The newspaper story ran 3 weeks later, buried on page 6 between advertisements for furniture sales and restaurant reviews. It mentioned possible connections between several missing person cases and suggested that police were reopening their investigations. No arrests were made, no bodies were found. The maintenance company quietly dissolved, its contracts transferred to other firms with different names but similar access. I still work in the same building, processing the same endless stream of documents. But now I pay attention to the small things, files that appear in unexpected places, windows that open without explanation, shadows that move when they should be still. Because I've learned that the most important truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the weight of small things and ask the questions that no one wants answered. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light slants through the blinds just right, I still see that first photograph in my mind. A woman with dark hair and knowing eyes, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame, her image preserved in a file that was never supposed to be found. She's still missing, they all are. But at least now someone remembers. Story 8. I remember how the envelope always lay in the same spot on the desk. Each morning its precise alignment never faltered, untouched by time or wind, but last Tuesday it was slightly askew, as if nudged by an unseen hand. This morning it was in the drawer, still sealed, yet somehow wrong. I can't recall moving it, and now I count the minutes, wondering why it keeps returning. But this time the edges were bent. The paper feels different between my fingers now, thicker somehow, though that makes no sense. I've been staring at this envelope for so long that the address has burned itself into my vision. The handwriting is familiar, yet I can't place it. When I close my eyes, I see those careful loops and deliberate slants, but they belong to no one I can name. The office smells of old coffee and something else. Something metallic that catches in my throat when I breathe too deeply. My colleague mentioned it once, asked if I'd noticed the strange odor that seemed to drift from the filing cabinets, but when maintenance checked, they found nothing. The smell comes and goes now, stronger when I'm alone with the envelope. I work in records, have for longer than I care to remember. My job is simple: catalog, file, retrieve. Documents pass through my hands like water, each one forgotten the moment it finds its proper place. But this envelope refuses to follow the rules. It appears and disappears, moves from surface to surface, always sealed, always waiting. The security guard mentioned seeing me here late one evening, hunched over my desk with papers spread around me like fallen leaves. But I don't remember staying late. I don't remember spreading papers. When I asked him to describe what he saw, his eyes shifted away from mine. He said I looked different somehow, more focused than usual, as if I was searching for something specific. My supervisor asked about my productivity. Apparently, several files have gone missing from my section, important documents that should have been processed and stored. She showed me the log sheets with my initials beside each missing file, but I have no memory of handling them. The handwriting looks like mine, yet the pressure of the pen seems wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. The envelope's return address leads to a street that doesn't exist. I checked the city directory twice, traced my finger along every road and avenue. The postal code is correct for our district, but the street name appears nowhere in the official records. When I called the post office, they had no explanation. The clerk suggested it might be an old address from before the recent rezoning, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that made my skin crawl. I've started taking photographs of the envelope's position each morning. The images reveal details my eyes miss in real time. In one photo, there's a smudge on the desk surface, as if someone with dirty fingers had touched the wood nearby. In another, the envelope casts a shadow that seems too long for the light source in the room. The camera doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain either. My dreams have become repetitive. I'm always in the office, always alone, always reaching for the envelope. But in the dreams, my hands look different. The skin is rougher, the nails shorter, as if they belong to someone who works with their hands in ways I never have. I wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the feeling that I've been somewhere I shouldn't have been. The janitor found me here one morning, asleep at my desk with the envelope clutched against my chest. He said I was muttering something about addresses that don't exist and files that refuse to stay filed. When I asked him what else I'd said, he looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. But I caught him watching me through the office window later that day, his expression troubled and wary. I decided to open the envelope. The decision came suddenly, without conscious thought, as if my hands had made the choice before my mind could object. But the seal resisted my fingers, the adhesive stronger than it should have been after all this time. When I finally worked one corner loose, a smell escaped that reminded me of rain on hot pavement and something else I couldn't identify. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper with my own handwriting, but not my current handwriting. This looked like my penmanship from years ago, before arthritis began to stiffen my joints and slow my pen. The message was simple, coordinates and a date. The coordinates led to a location I recognized but had never visited. The date was from last month, a day I remembered as unremarkable until now. I drove to the coordinates after work. The location was a small park on the edge of town, the kind of place families bring children to play on rusted swings and feed ducks in a murky pond. But the park felt wrong, as if the shadows fell at incorrect angles and the sounds of distant traffic came from the wrong direction. I sat on a bench and waited, though I couldn't say what I was waiting for. A woman approached as the light began to fade. She was older, with gray hair and clothes that suggested she'd been walking for a long time. She sat beside me without invitation and asked if I was the one who'd been leaving the messages. When I said I didn't know what she meant, she studied my face with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She told me about her daughter, how she'd worked in records at a government office, how she'd started acting strangely in the months before she disappeared, how she'd mentioned an envelope that kept moving around her desk, how she'd complained about missing files and forgotten conversations. The woman's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she spoke. I wanted to tell her she was mistaken, that I'd never met her daughter, that I was just someone who worked with documents and filing systems. But something in her description felt familiar, like a story I'd heard before or a dream I'd forgotten upon waking. When she showed me a photograph, the face looked back at me with eyes I recognized from mirrors, though the features belonged to someone younger. The woman said her daughter had been investigating something at work, a pattern in the files that didn't make sense, documents that referenced events that had never officially happened. She'd become obsessed with finding the truth, staying late at the office, making copies of records that weren't supposed to exist. Then one day, she simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and an envelope that no one could explain. I walked back to my car with the woman's words echoing in my mind. The envelope in my office suddenly felt heavier, more significant, as if it carried weight beyond its physical presence. I thought about the missing files, the forgotten conversations, the dreams that felt more real than my waking hours. The pieces of a puzzle were there, but the picture they formed remained just out of focus. The next morning, the envelope was back on my desk, but it wasn't alone. 3 other envelopes sat beside it, each one bearing the same impossible address, each one sealed with the same resistant adhesive. My hands trembled as I reached for them, and I noticed that my fingernails were shorter than they had been the day before, with dirt embedded beneath them as if I'd been digging. I checked the security footage from the previous night. The cameras showed me entering the building after hours, but the figure on the screen moved differently than I remembered moving. More purposeful, more certain, as if following a plan I hadn't consciously made. I watched myself retrieve files from cabinets I rarely accessed, spread documents across multiple desks, and work with an intensity that seemed foreign to my usual methodical pace. The files I'd been working with were gone by morning. No trace of them remained in the cabinets or on the desks where I'd seen myself place them. But the envelopes had multiplied, and each one contained coordinates and dates that meant nothing to my conscious mind, yet felt vitally important to some deeper part of myself that I was only beginning to acknowledge. I returned to the park, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The woman was there again, but this time she wasn't alone. Others sat on benches and walked along the paths, all with the same lost expression, all carrying envelopes or photographs or pieces of paper covered with handwriting that looked familiar yet strange. We were a community of the confused, united by questions we couldn't properly formulate. One man showed me a letter he'd been receiving for months, always in his mailbox despite having no return address and no postmark. The handwriting was his own, but he swore he'd never written the words. A woman clutched a file folder filled with documents that referenced her by name in context she couldn't remember, describing meetings she'd never attended and decisions she'd never made. We compared our experiences like patients sharing symptoms of the same mysterious illness. The missing time, the familiar yet foreign handwriting, the sense of being watched by ourselves from some impossible angle. None of us could explain what was happening, but together our individual confusions began to form a pattern that was somehow more disturbing than our separate mysteries. I drive home now with 4 envelopes on the passenger seat, their bent edges catching the light from passing street lamps. My reflection in the rearview mirror looks tired, older than I remember, with eyes that seem to hold knowledge I haven't consciously acquired. The metallic smell from the office clings to my clothes, and I wonder if it's been there all along, if I've simply been breathing it in so gradually that I've forgotten what clean air tastes like. The envelopes will be waiting for me tomorrow morning, arranged with the same precise alignment that first caught my attention. But now I understand that their position isn't random, isn't the result of unseen hands or supernatural intervention. The hands that move them are mine, guided by a part of my mind that operates in the spaces between sleep and waking, between memory and forgetting. I am both the mystery and its investigator, both the victim and the perpetrator of crimes I can't quite remember committing. The files that go missing pass through my hands in hours I don't recall living, sorted and hidden by a version of myself that emerges when my conscious mind retreats. The woman in the park wasn't describing her daughter's story. She was describing mine, filtered through the lens of someone who could see the pattern from the outside. The envelopes continue to multiply, and with each new arrival, I feel myself fragmenting further, becoming less certain of which version of my thoughts and actions belongs to the person I believe myself to be. The coordinates led to places I've been but don't remember visiting, dates that mark events I've participated in but can't recall experiencing. Tomorrow I will photograph the envelopes again, document their positions and contents, search for clues to mysteries that I am simultaneously creating and solving. The investigation continues, circular and endless, with each answer generating new questions that lead back to the same impossible place where truth and delusion meet in the space of a bent envelope edge, and the lingering scent of something metallic that might be fear or guilt, or the simple residue of a mind coming apart at the seams. The desk waits in the darkness, patient and knowing, ready to receive whatever arrangement of evidence my sleeping hands will provide. Story 9. The tap turned, yet no water ran. In the mirror my reflection seemed slower, a split second behind, mirroring movements with deliberate hesitation. As I padded down the hall, the floor felt foreign beneath my feet, a texture not quite remembered. The calendar on the wall, pages ghostly in the dawn light, marked a day I had not yet lived. In the kitchen, the kettle steamed, its whistle echoing a note I swear I'd heard before somewhere, not here, not now. But when the toast slipped from the counter, it fell without a sound. I knew something had shifted overnight. The morning felt borrowed, like stepping into someone else's routine. My coffee mug sat exactly where I always left it, but the handle faced the wrong direction. Small things, meaningless things, or so I told myself as I dressed for work, choosing the blue shirt from the closet, the one that smelled faintly of fabric softener and something else I couldn't place. The logical explanation came easily enough. I'd been working late for weeks, reviewing case files until my eyes burned and the letters blurred together. Sleep deprivation plays tricks on the mind, makes familiar spaces feel alien. The investigation had consumed me a missing person case that should have been straightforward but kept unraveling like poorly knitted wool. Each thread I pulled revealed 3 more loose ends. She had disappeared on a Tuesday, that much was certain. Her car remained in the parking lot of the shopping center, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. The surveillance footage showed her entering the building at 2:15 in the afternoon, but no cameras caught her leaving. I'd watched that grainy video dozens of times, memorizing the way she pushed through the glass doors, how she paused to check her phone, the casual swing of her arms as she walked toward the department store. The security guard remembered her. Average height, dark coat, nothing remarkable. She'd asked about the restroom locations. He pointed toward the back of the store, near the customer service desk. After that, nothing. The trail went cold in a maze of clothing racks and fluorescent lights. But as I drove to the office that morning, my hands gripping the steering wheel with unusual force, fragments of something else began to surface. A scent in my car that didn't belong, not perfume exactly, more like the smell of rain on hot pavement. The radio played a song I'd never heard before, yet I found myself humming along, knowing the melody before each note arrived. At my desk, I spread the case files across the surface, photographs and witness statements forming their familiar pattern. The missing woman's face stared up at me from a dozen different angles: driver's license photo, family snapshots, a professional headshot from her workplace. In each image, she looked directly at the camera, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to shift depending on the light, the angle of my gaze. My partner knocked on the door frame, coffee in hand, asking about progress on the case. I heard myself explaining the timeline again, the same details I'd recited countless times. She'd gone shopping. She'd vanished somewhere between the entrance and the exit. No signs of struggle, no witnesses to anything unusual. A mystery wrapped in the mundane routine of an afternoon errand. Yet even as I spoke, another version whispered at the edges of my consciousness. In this shadow narrative, the details rearranged themselves like puzzle pieces forced into the wrong spaces. The woman in the surveillance footage moved differently, her steps more deliberate, less casual. She wasn't shopping at all. She was meeting someone. The pause at the entrance wasn't to check her phone, but to scan the crowd, looking for a familiar face. I found myself returning to the shopping center that afternoon, walking the same path she'd taken. The security guard nodded in recognition. I'd been there so many times he probably knew my schedule better than I did. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that peculiar retail glow that makes all seasons feel like winter. Near the customer service desk, I stopped. The floor tiles here were different, newer, as if they'd been replaced recently. When I asked the manager about it, she shrugged. Routine maintenance, she said. Water damage from a leak in the ceiling. Nothing unusual. But her eyes didn't quite meet mine, and she excused herself quickly, disappearing into the maze of inventory and cash registers. That evening I sat in my kitchen with the case files spread across the table. The same photographs, the same statements, the same timeline that led nowhere. but the woman's face seemed different now, more familiar somehow. Had I seen her before the disappearance, at a coffee shop perhaps, or in line at the bank? The possibility nagged at me like a half-remembered dream. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to that Tuesday afternoon. In the official version, I'd been at my desk making phone calls, following up on leads, but underneath that certainty, another memory stirred. I was driving somewhere, windows down, radio playing. There was urgency in my movements, purpose in my destination. My phone had buzzed with a message, and I'd pulled over to read it. The words swam in my recollection, important but just beyond reach. The next morning brought the same strange displacement. Water that didn't flow, reflections that lagged, floors that felt foreign. I was beginning to recognize the sensation, like waking from anesthesia to find the world slightly rearranged. In the bathroom mirror, I studied my own face, looking for signs of the previous day's wear. There were none. My skin looked rested, unmarked by the late nights and stress that should have accumulated by now. At the office, new information arrived. A witness had come forward, someone who claimed to have seen the missing woman at a restaurant across town, hours after she'd supposedly vanished from the shopping center. The timing made no sense. If she'd left the mall, why hadn't the cameras caught her? If she'd gone to the restaurant willingly, why abandon her car and purse? I drove to the restaurant, a small place tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. The waitress remembered her clearly. She'd sat alone at a corner table, ordered coffee and pie, seemed nervous. She kept checking her watch, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. When I showed the waitress my badge, asked for more details, her expression changed. She'd already talked to someone about this, she said. Another investigator just yesterday. But I was the only one assigned to this case. My partner was handling different files, and no one else in the department had shown interest in what seemed like a routine missing person situation. When I pressed for details about this other investigator, the waitress grew vague. Medium height, she thought, professional looking, had asked all the same questions I was asking now. The drive back to the office felt longer than usual, as if the streets had stretched while I wasn't looking. Traffic lights stayed red longer, familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong order. By the time I reached the station, the sun was setting, though my watch insisted it was barely past noon. In the evidence room, I pulled the box containing her personal effects. Purse, keys, phone, wallet, all the ordinary artifacts of a life interrupted. I'd examined these items before, but now I handled them with different eyes. The phone's call history showed nothing unusual, but the last message sent was to a number I didn't recognize. The text was simple: "I'm ready." Ready for what? I tried calling the number, but it rang endlessly, never reaching voicemail or disconnection. The phone company had no record of it existing, yet there it was in the message log, impossible to explain away. That night I dreamed of the shopping center, but in the dream I wasn't investigating. I was meeting someone, walking quickly through the fluorescent-lit corridors with purpose and anticipation. The woman from the photographs was there, but she wasn't missing. She was waiting, smiling, reaching out her hand as I approached. When I woke, my palm tingled as if I'd actually grasped something real. The days began to blur together, each morning bringing the same displaced sensations, each afternoon revealing new impossibilities in the case. Witnesses who remembered things that couldn't have happened, evidence that appeared and disappeared like smoke, security footage that showed different scenes depending on when I viewed it. My reflection in mirrors became increasingly unreliable, sometimes showing me in clothes I wasn't wearing, expressions I wasn't making. The tap in my bathroom continued its stubborn refusal to produce water, though the pipes throughout the rest of the house worked perfectly. The calendar on my wall displayed dates that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I began to suspect I was the missing person I'd been searching for. Not literally, I could see myself, touch my own face, confirm my presence in the world. But some essential part of me had vanished that Tuesday afternoon, leaving behind a hollow investigator going through the motions of a case that might never have existed at all. The woman in the photograph smiled at me now with recognition, as if we shared a secret I couldn't quite remember. In my dreams, we met regularly in places that defied geography, shopping centers that led to restaurants that opened onto empty parking lots where cars sat with keys in their ignitions, waiting for passengers who would never return. I stopped filing reports. There was nothing concrete to document, no progress to measure. The case existed in a space between reality and possibility, neither solved nor abandoned. Sometimes I wondered if I should declare her found, since she seemed more present in my daily life than most people I could actually touch. The mirror this morning showed my reflection, arriving a full second before I did, as if it had finally grown tired of waiting for me to catch up. The tap turned freely, producing a steady stream of water that tasted like nothing I'd ever experienced, not metallic, not chemical, just the pure absence of flavor. The toast fell from the counter with a sound like breaking glass, though it landed softly and whole. I know now that some mysteries are designed never to be solved, only to be lived within. The missing woman and I occupy the same space between certainty and doubt, between the story everyone believes and the truth that exists in the spaces between words. We are both here and gone, found and lost, real and imagined. The case file sits on my desk, as complete and incomplete as it will ever be. Tomorrow I will open it again, study the same photographs, read the same statements, search for clues in a puzzle that rearranges itself each time I think I understand its shape. And somewhere in a shopping center that may or may not exist, in a restaurant that serves coffee to people who are both present and absent, the investigation continues without me, or because of me, or despite me. The only certainty is uncertainty itself. And in that space, we are all missing persons, all investigators, all witnesses to crimes that may have been committed against reality itself. Story 10. The faucet didn't drip when I twisted it. My fingers brushed its surface, seeking the usual coolness, but it remained tepid and unresponsive. The air felt thick as I walked through the room, my footsteps muffled against the rug that usually whispered. Objects seemed frozen in place, each shadow holding its breath, waiting for an answer that never came. I reached for the light switch, but the wall gave no feedback, as if refusing my touch. I paused, eyes tracing the outline of the window, but the outside world offered no glimpse back. The glass felt more like a barrier than a portal, leaving me uncertain of what lay beyond. That metallic taste comes back to me now, always starts that way when I try to remember, like copper pennies pressed against my tongue, or maybe it's the memory of fear itself. I can taste it right now as I speak these words into the empty air. There was a photograph, I think there was a photograph. The edges were worn smooth from handling, corners soft like fabric. Someone had been looking at it for a long time before I found it, or maybe I'd been the one doing the looking. My hands shake when I try to picture where I found it. Kitchen drawer, bedroom nightstand. The details slip away like water through fingers. But I remember the face in the picture, sort of remember. The features keep shifting when I concentrate too hard. Young face, I think, smiling, or maybe not smiling. Maybe the expression was something else entirely. You don't remember, do you? That voice, someone said that to me once, recently, long ago. The tone was gentle, almost pitying, like speaking to a child who'd forgotten their own name. But I can't place the speaker, can't even tell if it was a man or woman speaking. The words just float there in my memory, disconnected from any mouth that might have shaped them. I was looking for something, that much feels certain. Moving through rooms with purpose, opening drawers, checking behind curtains. My hands knew what they were searching for even if my mind had forgotten. Muscle memory guiding me through the motions of seeking. The carpet in the hallway was different, newer. The pile stood up straight and uniform, not worn down by footsteps like the rest of the house. Someone had replaced just that section. Why would someone replace just that section? I knelt down and ran my palm across the boundary where old Met knew. The texture change was sharp, deliberate, like a scar in the floor's memory. My fingers found the edges where the carpet had been cut, and I wondered what stain or damage had necessitated the replacement. "It's better this way." Another voice different from the first. This one carried weight, authority, the kind of voice that expected agreement rather than questions. But again, I can't attach it to a face or a moment. These fragments of conversation drift through my recollection like smoke. The basement door was locked. I remember standing before it, hand on the knob, feeling the mechanism refuse to turn. The wood around the lock looked fresh, unstained by the wear that marked the rest of the house. Someone had installed new hardware recently. Someone wanted to keep that door closed. But I had a key. Somehow I had a key. The metal felt warm in my palm, warmer than it should have been, like it had been recently held by other fingers. I slipped it into the lock and felt the tumblers align with a soft click that seemed too loud in the quiet house. The stairs descended into darkness. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The air grew cooler as I went down, carrying scents I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, exactly, but unfamiliar, like a room that had been closed up for too long. My hand found the light switch at the bottom. The bulb flickered twice before settling into a steady glow that revealed boxes stacked along the walls. Cardboard containers sealed with tape, labeled in handwriting I almost recognized. The letters looked familiar but remained just beyond comprehension, like trying to read in a dream. I opened the nearest box. Clothes, children's clothes, folded neatly and arranged by size. Tiny shirts and pants that would fit a small person, someone young. The fabric felt soft under my fingers, well cared for, loved. But there was something wrong with the collection, something that made my stomach clench with unease. They were all the same size. Every piece of clothing in that box, and in the boxes beside it, cut for the same small frame. As if someone had been shopping for a child who never grew, never changed, never needed larger sizes as the seasons passed. They were so happy here. The third voice, this one whispered, barely audible, sad in a way that made my chest tight, but happy too, somehow, like remembering something beautiful that had been lost. I found myself back upstairs without remembering the climb. The basement door was locked again, key nowhere to be found. Had I imagined the descent, the boxes, the clothes that never grew larger? But my hands still smelled like basement air, still carried the scent of fabric that had been touched by fingers other than my own. The photograph was on the kitchen table now. I was certain it hadn't been there before, but there it sat in the center of the surface, edges aligned with the wood grain as if placed with careful precision. The face in the picture looked up at me with eyes that seemed familiar and strange at once. I picked it up and turned it over, writing on the back, faded but legible. Words that should have meant something, should have unlocked the mystery I was trying to solve. But the letters swam before my eyes, refusing to hold still long enough for comprehension. The faucet was dripping again, steady rhythm that hadn't been there before. Each drop struck the sink basin with a soft ping that counted off seconds I couldn't account for. When had it started? How long had I been standing there holding the photograph? Time moves differently here. Fourth voice, or maybe the first voice again, changed by whatever had happened between then and now. The words carried certainty, as if explaining a simple fact about the nature of this place. But I couldn't understand what they meant, couldn't grasp why time would behave strangely within these walls. I set the photograph down and walked to the window. The glass was fogged now, condensation obscuring whatever lay beyond. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and peered out at a landscape that shifted even as I watched. Trees where there had been buildings, sky where there had been ground. Nothing stayed fixed long enough for me to orient myself. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The questions felt important, but the answers remained elusive, dancing just beyond reach like shadows cast by flickering flames. My reflection in the glass looked wrong. The features were mine, but arranged differently, as if someone had tried to reconstruct my face from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too small. Or maybe I was the one who was wrong. Maybe this was how I'd always looked and I'd simply forgotten. You're remembering now. Fifth voice, pleased, encouraging, like a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. But remembering what? The fragments in my mind remained scattered, refusing to coalesce into coherent understanding. I walked back to the kitchen table. The photograph was gone again. In its place sat a single key, the same key I'd used to unlock the basement door, or a different key that looked identical. The metal was cool now, holding no trace of the warmth I remembered. I picked it up and felt its weight in my palm. Such a small thing to carry such significance. But significant in what way? What door was it meant to open? What secret was it meant to reveal? The basement called to me again, that locked door, those boxes, those clothes that never grew. But when I approached the door, key in hand, I found it standing open. Had I left it that way, the darkness below seemed deeper now, more complete. The light switch at the bottom might as well have been on another planet. I descended anyway. The boxes were different this time. Same cardboard containers, same careful arrangement, but the labels had changed. The handwriting was clearer now, more familiar. I could almost read the words, almost understand what they were trying to tell me. But almost wasn't enough. I opened a different box, more clothes, but adult sizes now. Shirts and pants that would fit someone my height, my build. The fabric felt familiar under my fingers, like garments I'd worn before, like clothes that belonged to me. But I was already wearing clothes. I looked down at myself, confirming the obvious. So why were identical outfits folded neatly in basement boxes? Why did they smell like my soap, my detergent, my life? You've been here before. Sixth voice, matter of fact, stating the obvious, but obvious to whom? I had no memory of this place beyond the fragments I was living through now. No recollection of previous visits, previous searches, previous discoveries. Yet the voice was right. I could feel the truth of it in my bones. This wasn't my first time in this house, wasn't my first descent into this basement, wasn't my first encounter with these mysterious boxes and their impossible contents. How many times had I been here? How many times had I forgotten? I climbed the stairs again, leaving the boxes unopened, their secrets intact. The basement door swung shut behind me with a soft click that sounded like finality, like an ending that was also a beginning. The kitchen was different now, same layout, same appliances, but the details had shifted. The faucet was chrome instead of brass. The table was round instead of rectangular. The window faced a different direction, offering views of landscapes that couldn't coexist in the same geographical space. I was changing too. I could feel it happening, could sense my memories reshuffling themselves like cards in an endless deck. What I'd thought I knew was being replaced by new certainties that felt equally fragile, equally temporary. The photograph was back, different photograph now, or the same photograph showing a different face. The features were clearer this time, more defined. I recognized them but couldn't place where or when I'd seen them before. Look closer. Seventh voice, urgent, insistent, like someone trying to wake a sleeper who was determined to remain unconscious. I held the photograph up to the light, squinting at the details I might have missed. The background, I'd been focusing on the face, but the background held clues I'd overlooked. A room, familiar in its unfamiliarity. Walls and furniture arranged in patterns that tickled the edges of recognition. This room, this kitchen, the photograph had been taken here in this very space. But when, and by whom, and why did the person in the picture look so much like someone I should remember but couldn't quite place? I turned the photograph over again. The writing on the back was clearer now, legible in a way it hadn't been before. Words that made sense individually but refused to form coherent meaning when strung together. Come back. Remember us. Don't forget again. Messages from whom, pleas or commands. The handwriting looked like mine but felt foreign, as if someone else had guided my hand while I formed the letters. The faucet's dripping had become a rhythm, a pattern that seemed almost musical. Each drop timed to match some internal metronome that kept pace with thoughts I couldn't quite think, memories I couldn't quite remember. I found myself moving through the house again, opening doors I'd already opened, searching drawers I'd already searched. But everything was different now, rearranged by invisible hands that worked while my attention was elsewhere. New photographs appeared and disappeared. New voices whispered fragments of conversation that might have been memory or imagination. New details emerged from corners and shadows, demanding attention I wasn't sure I wanted to give. The truth was assembling itself around me whether I wanted it to or not, pieces clicking into place with the inevitability of a mechanism designed for this single purpose. But I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever picture those pieces would ultimately form. It's time. Eighth voice, final voice, the one that had been waiting patiently while all the others spoke their parts. This voice carried authority that brooked no argument, certainty that allowed no doubt. Time for what? I wanted to ask, but found I had no voice of my own anymore. The words were there in my throat, but refused to emerge, as if speaking them would break some essential spell that held this place together. I walked back to the kitchen one last time. The photograph sat on the table, face down now. I reached for it, but stopped before my fingers made contact. Did I really want to see what image it held now? Did I really want to know whose face would be looking back at me? The faucet's dripping grew louder, more insistent. Each drop echoed through the house like a countdown, marking moments that led inevitably toward some conclusion I wasn't prepared to face. But I turned the photograph over anyway. The face looking back at me was my own, not as I appeared now, but as I had been. Before this place, before these voices, before these fragments of memory that might not have been memories at all. I was smiling in the picture, happy in a way I couldn't remember being, surrounded by a life I couldn't recall living. The background showed this same kitchen, but brighter somehow, more alive, more real than the version I was standing in now. When had the photograph been taken? Who had held the camera? Why did I look so different, so much more solid and present than I felt now? The writing on the back had changed again. Only 3 words this time, but they carried weight that pressed against my chest like a physical force. You are home. Home, the word should have brought comfort, should have provided the answer I'd been searching for. But instead it filled me with a dread I couldn't name, a certainty that home was not always a place of safety and warmth. I set the photograph down and looked around the kitchen with new eyes. The details that had seemed random now formed a pattern. The replaced carpet in the hallway, the locked basement door, the boxes of clothes that never grew, the faucet that dripped with mechanical precision. This wasn't just a house, it was a trap, a carefully constructed maze designed to hold something that wanted to escape, or someone. But was I the prisoner or the guard, the victim or the architect? The fragments in my memory refused to align in ways that would answer those questions. The voices began speaking again, all at once now. A chorus of whispers that filled the air with words I couldn't separate or understand. They seemed to be arguing, debating, trying to reach some consensus about what should happen next. I backed toward the door, suddenly desperate to leave this place behind. But when I reached for the handle, my hand passed through it like it was made of mist. The door remained solid to my eyes, but offered no substance to my touch. I was trapped, had always been trapped. The search, the discovery, the gradual revelation, it had all been an elaborate performance staged for an audience of one. Me, playing out the same script over and over, forgetting each iteration as it ended so I could experience the shock of discovery anew. How many times had I lived through this sequence? How many times had I found the photograph, descended to the basement, read the messages written in my own hand? How many times had I reached this moment of understanding only to have it stripped away so the cycle could begin again? The faucet's dripping slowed, then stopped entirely. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the sound had been. It meant something was ending or beginning. I walked back to the sink and placed my fingers on the faucet's surface. It was tepid and unresponsive, just as it had been when this all started. The metal gave no feedback, offered no clues about what would happen next. But I knew what would happen next. The cycle would reset, the fragments would scatter. The voices would fall silent until it was time to guide me through the performance once more. I would forget this moment of clarity, this glimpse behind the curtain of my own imprisonment. I would become the searcher again, the confused narrator trying to piece together a mystery that had no solution because it had no end. The photograph flickered on the table, image shifting between faces I recognized and strangers I'd never seen. My own reflection wavered in the window glass, features rearranging themselves for the next iteration of the story. Soon I would twist the faucet again, seeking coolness that wouldn't come. I would walk through rooms where shadows held their breath. I would reach for light switches that offered no response. And I would begin again, fresh and confused and desperate for answers that would always remain just beyond reach. The taste of copper pennies filled my mouth as the world began to fade around the edges. The last thing I saw was the photograph, now blank, waiting for whatever face it would need to wear for the next performance. The faucet didn't drip when I twisted it.